Part 3. The Revelation. Chapter 18. Billy and Rio traveled the winding road up the mountain on their way to Lake Tahoe. Once again, he was driving her car while she rode shotgun. Kryptonite by Three Doors Down pounded out over the radio as she admired the mountainous terrain. Rio sang along with the tune while keeping her eye on a black SUV in the side view mirror. The fact that they were being followed hadn't eluded her. If Turner thought it had, he'd underestimated her. Prior to reaching the south shore of the lake, they stopped at Vista Point. Many years ago, the locale had been turned into a scenic spot, showcasing the gigantic scattered boulders, many stacked on top of one another. The only thing that had changed since Maggie and Tejon's day was that modern civilization had built one guard wall against the south side. Rio sat silently on the man-made railing, gazing out over the magnificent sight before her. The lake stretched for miles in all directions, surrounded in its entirety by the colossal mountains of the Sierra Nevada. Billy leaned against a huge rock. "You seem to be right at home." "I do like it here." Her eyes stayed glued to the lake. "I can't quite put my finger on it." She looked at him. "But I feel a sense of comfort here." "This was probably a place where Tejon and Maggie spent much of their time." Rio wasn't her usual spunky self. She seemed preoccupied. "Hey, I'm going to go find a bathroom. You want to come?" In his own way, he was offering to leave her alone for a while so she could work out whatever was bothering her. "I'd like to stay here," she said, "if you don't mind." "That's okay," he said. "I'll be back soon." He walked away, and Rio decided to explore. Almost in a daze, she wandered through the area until, unbeknownst to her, she came to the place where Tejon had asked Maggie to marry him, and then claimed her as his own. Rio climbed onto the same boulder the star-crossed lovers had made love on all those years ago. She examined the rock and eased down. Lying on her back, she propped her feet up. She closed her eyes and covered them with her forearm. Why couldn't she get the warrior out of her head? Was she losing her mind? He was just a face painted on a canvas. Granted, a captivating face, but it was nothing more than that. The man had been dead for over 100 years. Still, Rio couldn't stop thinking about him. A chill breezed through her as she wondered what it must have been like having Tejon looming above her in the throes of passion. Her sexually inspired musings were invaded by the sudden smell of an unusual aroma that seemed almost sweet in a masculine sort of way, and quite unlike anything she'd ever perceived, even though it felt familiar. She could almost swear she felt his lips brush against her cheek. Overwhelmed with the certainty that if she opened her eyes she'd see Tejon, she didn't dare try it. Instead, she savored the thought of his tongue exploring her neck in a tantalizing way. She swore she felt his long hair tickling her breasts. But how was that possible? She wasn't naked. Rio's eyes sprang open, and she jumped up. Tejon was not there. In fact, no one was there. And that was somehow disheartening. Surveying her surroundings, she saw Billy heading her way from the end of the trail. She scrambled to cover herself and felt the heat burning her cheeks when she remembered that she was fully clothed. Unable to rid herself of the flush that had fallen over her at the mere thought of, hey, what was that anyway? Billy stopped next to her. "Uh-oh." The corner of his lip twisted. "There it is again." "What?" She glanced down, making sure she wasn't actually as naked as she felt. This thing, whatever it was that she'd experienced, seemed so real. She could still recall Tejon's hair tickling her breasts. "You know." Billy folded his arms across his chest and leaned against the rock. "That same look you got when you thought you saw yourself getting your picture taken with Maggie's sisters." Rio looked away, defeat swelling inside her. "What?" Billy laughed nervously. "What happened while I was gone?" I don't know. She shrugged, trying to blow it off. I fell asleep. I was having a dream, I guess. A dream? He looked at her. About what? She shook her head. Can't remember. Well, personally, I think you can, but I'm not going to push. If you don't want to talk about it, he said with a slight nod, that's up to you. How could she? How could she tell this virtual stranger, a man she also happened to be conning, that she was fantasizing about his third great-grandfather? Chapter 19. Rio and Billy sat across from each other in a booth at Grandma Hattie's, a restaurant that was popular with the locals, and with good reason. They served up excellent food, and Rio was growing fond of their blintzes. Considering Billy's opinion of Maggie, one would think he'd shy as far away from Rio as he could. Billy hated Maggie. He hated her for destroying Tejon's life. That's the way he saw the story, and no amount of talking could convince him otherwise. In light of that, being around Rio should be the last thing he'd want. It stood to reason that her being there would seem like his worst nightmare had come to life, to haunt him. But that wasn't the case at all. The more time he spent with her, the more he felt drawn and connected to her. And the bond was pure. As far as Billy knew, Rio Larroquette was indeed his cousin. He never thought for a second that that could possibly be a lie. The waitress set a hot tea plate down in front of Rio and poured a cup of coffee for Billy. Rio dropped the tea bag into the pot and reached for the sugar. Grabbing several packets, she ripped them apart and dumped the contents into her empty cup. Pouring the tea, she cast a stealthy glance across the room. She hadn't yet made eye contact with the two men watching Billy and her from a booth near the entrance. She planned to let them flitter in the wind a little while longer. It wasn't time to let Turner's goons know that she was onto them. But she was going to have to tell Billy sooner or later. Yep, the time was drawing close. She looked at Billy. What do you think we should do now? The thought of finding a bona fide treasure was becoming more and more intriguing. We've got to figure out how to read that map, he said. We're certainly not going to find anything out until we can do that. Rio checked on their tails. They were still there. Without missing a beat, she looked back at Billy. Yeah, but... She dipped a spoon into her hot tea and stirred it. That map makes absolutely no sense at all. She pointed her spoon at Billy and then laid it on the saucer alongside the cup. Even your dad says so. Maybe we need to talk to him again. Okay. She tilted her head to one side. We'll go see your dad again, if you think it'll help. If somebody didn't come up with something, the odds of them finding the treasure were pretty much non-existent. What did they expect? To just stumble across it? Well, I'm at a loss, he said. Maybe he's got some ideas. But in reality, Billy knew he didn't. With a new plan, or at least the seeds of a new plan, they finished their breakfast, paid the check, and then headed out. They crossed the parking lot and strode toward Rio's car. Billy fished the keys out of his Levi's pocket and unlocked the door. Glancing up, she saw the black SUV parked a few spaces over that had been following them for the last few days. Rio and Billy headed to his parents' house, and she never said a word about the SUV or that they were being followed. All that morning, Bill Tejon had done everything and anything he could think of while trying not to think about what he truly didn't want to consider. Rio, Maggie, and Tejon. He knew the legend, but he'd never put much stock in it. Oh, he was all for the romanticized idea of Tejon and Maggie. However, he'd never been real big on the idea that a reincarnated Maggie would come waltzing back into the Washoe people's lives, dig up that treasure, and give it to them. He'd always been so sure that this particular event was never going to happen. Even now, after his niece had appeared on the scene, he was still trying to convince himself that this sort of thing couldn't happen. But no matter what he tried to tell himself, the fact remained that here she was, in the flesh, Every logical fiber of his being told him that Rio was not Maggie. But his denial gave him little comfort, since Rio appeared to be an exact replica of his great-great-grandmother. Inside the Tejon living room, Bill listened to Billy and Rio's dilemma. Once they'd laid out the facts as they knew them, he paused in silence for the longest time. Bill cleared his throat and folded his arms over his chest. "Well," he gave them both a quick look, "the first thing you've got to do is stop thinking like Billy and Rio." "Excuse me?" Rio's brow crinkled. "For starters, you need to start thinking like Tejon and Maggie, especially Maggie," he said. "If you were her, where would you bury it?" "I'd bury it out in the hills," Billy said. "Well, that sure narrows it down." Rio's voice was considerate but comical. "Now doesn't it?" Bill planted his hands on the arms of his easy chair and pushed himself up. Heading toward the dining room, he motioned them to follow. They waited by the table while Bill retrieved a topo map from a cabinet. He spread it out over the table, and Rio shivered, feeling like the portraits of Maggie and Tejon were watching their every move. Father and son huddled over the map, and a rather timid Rio finally joined them. "Now this is VC," Bill pointed out the location on the map. "And here's 6 Mile Canyon." He paused long enough to look at Rio. "The Comstock lode was discovered there, and this is the route they used." He traced his finger along the map without looking at it. "To take the gold and silver out of Virginia City." He looked back to the map and pointed to the area between Virginia City and Silver City, referred to as Devil's Gate. "This is where holdups usually happened." He waited a moment, giving her time to process the information, and then addressed them both. "So, say you conducted one of these holdups." He fanned his hand out over the map. "Where would you take your loot and bury it?" "I don't know." Rio shrugged. "Close my eyes and throw a dart?" Billy and Rio left his parents' house and strolled across the front yard. He unlatched the gate and held it open for her, then relatched it and followed her to his Jeep, parked alongside the fence. "Hey, you want to get a pizza for dinner?" He climbed into the driver's side of the vehicle. "Sure." She flashed him a piss-poor smile before turning to look outside the window. The girl was carrying a burden, one that was much too heavy for her delicate shoulders. Billy didn't know how to help her. He wasn't sure he could. "So," he said, suspecting that she wasn't there with him, not mentally. "You like your pizza with some anchovies and maybe a little moldy cheese thrown on top?" he asked, just to prove to himself that he was right. She wasn't listening. "Yeah, sure, that's fine." Her words were vague and methodical as she continued to stare out the window. "Rio," he gave her a gentle, backhanded smack on the arm. "What?" She looked at him, rubbing her arm. A fine actress, that one was. "You agreed to pizza with anchovies and moldy cheese. What gives?" "Gotta admit," she said, "this new family, the whole history thing with Maggie and Tejon." She shook her head slowly. "It's a little overwhelming. Maggie and Tejon were nothing but a recipe for disaster. How could her own grandfather take her away from him?" Rio didn't understand why it had had to be that way, and she didn't like it. But that story had played out decades ago. No amount of wishing or wanting was going to make it so that things could have turned out differently for Maggie and Tejon. "Bradford Fuller was trying to keep Tejon alive," Billy said, without much sympathy, guiding the Jeep into the parking lot of the pizza place. He and Rio got out and headed inside. Moments later, they emerged. Billy had the pizza, and Rio had their sodas. Approaching the Jeep, Rio surveyed the city around her. She stalled so she could come up with an argument on Maggie and Tejon's behalf, if for no one other than herself. Instead, she found the two guys who'd been tailing them for days now. She scanned right on by them and got into the Jeep. As Billy climbed in and closed his door, she leaned toward him. It was time. "We're being followed," she whispered, as if someone might hear her. "I know," he said with a slight nod. "For a few days now." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Any idea who it is?" "Nobody I know," she said, rolling her eyes. That much was true. After they arrived back at Billy's house, she opened the Jeep's door and looked at him. She knew what she had to do. "Hey, listen," she said, digging for the keys inside her purse. "I'm going to go over to that Walmart I saw at the end of town. I need to pick up a few things." "Okay." He removed a key from his key ring. "Here." He offered it to her. "A house key for you." She took the key and stuck one leg outside the vehicle and planted her foot on the ground. "But listen, why don't you come inside and eat first?" he suggested. "Walmart is open all night." She hesitated before saying, "Okay." Besides, that'd give her time to cool off. Boy, she needed that. She was pretty pissed right now. She'd told Turner not to put a tail on them, but he'd gone and done it anyway. The unwanted company wasn't helping. Rio took the time to eat, but it didn't do much for her need to calm down. By the time she arrived at Walmart, she'd worked herself up pretty good. She headed for the prepaid cell phones and snatched up one that came with less than 30 minutes. She wouldn't need a quarter of that time to get her point across. She paid for the cell phone, asked the clerk to open it, and he obliged her further by assembling the device as a courtesy. She walked away from the phone center, pushing her cart with one hand and holding the phone in the other. She headed for the health and beauty aisle, knowing that's what all men expected girls to buy when they went to a store like Walmart. That and clothes. After passing a few racks of dresses, she paused long enough to dial Turner's number and then proceeded through the store at a snail's pace, waiting for him to answer her call. When she finally heard his voice, fury pushed out her words. "It's Rio. Back them off now." "Rio, surely you can understand that I'm protecting my investment." Turner's voice was condescending. That pissed her off even more. "And surely you can understand that I work alone. They're there for the duration. Well, you just make sure they don't approach us claiming to know me." She let her anger bite her tone. "Because if they do, I'm out and Billy Tejon learns the truth." Rio moved the phone away from her head and looked at it. Turner's boisterous voice echoed from the device, but she only laughed and disconnected the call. The Las Vegas mobster was under the mistaken impression that he was still in charge, but that had changed the minute she realized she was the key to his plan's success. She went about her business, loading her cart with enough items to make it look good, and headed for the checkout. After all, she couldn't return to Billy's house empty-handed. Detail. That's one of the things that made Rio so good at what she did. Chapter 20. Billy lived in a quiet neighborhood. His house was clearly a man's home, furnished with only the essentials. If Billy didn't need it, he didn't have it. His decor wasn't exceptional, but it was efficient. It just lacked a woman's touch. He grabbed a couple of cold beers from the fridge and headed into the living room where Rio was waiting. They needed to figure out how to read the map. But more than that, Billy wanted to know who was following them. And better yet, how they knew to follow them in the first place. As for Rio, she didn't know who the guys were, but she did know why they were there. She just couldn't tell Billy. This thing had to play itself out, and she would try her best not to let the Tejons get too caught up in it. "The first thing we've got to do is figure out how to deal with our guests." Billy handed her a beer. "They seem to be showing up everywhere we go." He sat down in the chair, kitty-corner from the couch, twisted the cap off his beer, and tossed it on the table. "Either someone knows what we're up to," she said, "or they want something from us. Either way, I got nothing I'm willing to part with." Ever been on a snipe hunt?
Once, when I was a kid.
The thought of it burned a hole in her ego.
But I wasn't in on the joke.
Rio tried to push the memory aside, but it filled her mind anyway. The counselors at summer camp, back when she was about 11 or 12, had everyone excited about the notion of a snipe hunt. She'd never even heard of a snipe, much less gone hunting for one. She had no idea what the damn thing was, but she wanted to fit in, so she mustered up some enthusiasm for the sport, just as everyone else had done, only to learn much later on that the joke was on her.
Well,
Billy's voice broke into her thoughts.
This time, you're in on the joke.
He laughed triumphantly.
But we're going to lead them on the biggest wild goose chase ever. By the time it's over, they won't know if they're coming or going.
Rio gave him an agreeable nod.
I do like the way you think.
The wild goose chase began in a place called Clear Creek Canyon. Billy stopped the Jeep on the side of the road. He and Rio exited the vehicle, and she followed him across the road. Massive cliffs protruding from the mountain above loomed over them. The sound of rushing water rumbled nearby, an indication that the creek was running strong. They paused on the side of the road. Rio peered down into the ravine. The thunderous roar of an aggressive waterfall echoed, giving away its hiding place behind a mass of thick brush and trees. That strange chill hit Rio again. At first, she wanted to run, but she was able to quickly cast aside the bizarre sensation. Billy grabbed her hand and coaxed her down the side of the embankment. There it was again, that cool, brisk frost rushing through her. Almost instantly, the chill turned into nerve-wracking apprehension. Rio's attention fell over the landscape, studying it intently. She was drawn to the gigantic cliffs above them. For a reason she couldn't explain, fear washed over her. Desperation urged her to leave the ravine.
I've got to get out of here.
She used her hands, trying to climb out.
Please.
A pleading quality entered her tone as she began sliding back down.
Help me get out of here.
Her voice shook.
It's okay.
Billy reached for her.
What's wrong?
Rio jerked away, dropped to her knees, and crawled up to the road.
I can't stay here,
she said, reaching the top of the embankment.
I don't know why, but I can't be here.
Billy scaled the embankment easily.
Hey, Rio, you okay?
She didn't stop. She didn't look at him. She kept moving forward, determined to get across the road and back to the Jeep.
Rio!
Billy called after her, more forceful this time.
Please take me away from here.
She didn't bother to look at him. She just got in the Jeep and stared straight ahead. In no way she was going to look back across the road. Something about that place creeped her out. Billy climbed into the driver's seat and looked at Rio.
You know where you are?
He asked.
Don't you? I have no idea where I am,
she said, short-tempered.
But what I do know is I cannot stay here. I don't know why, but I feel like I'm going to die here. Rio, calm down.
He laid a gentle hand on her forearm.
You're not going to die here. This is where Maggie and Tejon died.
Rio's lungs tightened. She gasped for air, grabbing at her chest. She didn't want to, but she couldn't help herself. She looked back across the road. 2 eagles flew out of the ravine. Watching them soar away, her breathing eased. The birds seemed to dance playfully in the sky. She pointed to them and looked at Billy.
Did you see that?
What?
The birds. No.
Billy gazed at the sky through the windshield.
I didn't see any birds,
he said, but continued to look for them.
but the eagles were gone. He turned the key and started the engine. As he steered the Jeep onto the road and rounded the first curve, the same black SUV was parked on the side of the road. Both Rio and Billy eyed their unwanted company as they passed them by. Chapter 21. Billy rolled out his father's topo map across the table in his dining room. He pinned the edges down with a couple of mugs and the salt and pepper shakers. "The snipe hunt is a good idea," she said. "It's a good cover while we try and figure out where the treasure's buried." "We can lead them on a wild goose chase day in and day out." That wasn't hard. Nobody knew these hills like Billy. "So, where do we start?" "Want to close your eyes and throw a dart?" he asked with a broad smile. "Very funny." She rolled her eyes and chuckled. There wasn't any rhyme, although there was some reason to the next few steps they chose to take. All Billy knew was some guys were following them. He could easily guess they were after something, but he didn't know what. He didn't have anything for anybody to want, not as far as he could see. So they must want what he was after. He discarded the idea that Rio might know more than she was letting on almost before it even fully formed. Maybe he'd been a bit suspicious of her in the beginning, but his father trusted her, and that was good enough for him. Besides, now that he'd gotten to know her, he felt a certain sort of kinship with her. There was a connection between them, one that ran so much deeper than the treasure they were after. Billy assumed it was because they were cousins. In the course of their snipe hunt, they picked out random sites and started digging. The way Billy saw it, if the bad guys didn't do anything but watch them dig, that'd say a lot about their motives. While Turner's goons watched from afar, Rio found it easy to lead them around at will. Billy chose sites, ones that made it convenient for their friends to watch from afar, which is exactly what they did, and nothing more. Billy started to think that maybe someone had overheard them somewhere along the way and decided to wait until he and Rio found the treasure before making their move. If that were the case, he was determined to confuse them and guide them in the direction he wanted them to go. He figured it was the least he could do, since they were determined to let him do all the dirty work. Billy and Rio instigated a well-thought-out plan. They'd pick out a spot, go up to it, and start digging. After a while, he'd throw the shovel down, she'd do the same, and they'd start pointing at each other and waving their hands in the air. From a distance, it looked like they were arguing, and for Turner's goons, it seemed real, at least through a pair of binoculars. But how long could this wild goose chase continue? Sooner or later, even the dumbest of dimwits would eventually catch on. Ultimately, Rio and Billy knew they had to come up with a better plan. For instance, one that would actually lead them to the treasure would be nice. If they figured out how to find the treasure, they'd also have to come up with a plan to deal with their friends. Billy was going to have to be the brains behind this operation because these days Rio had a one-track mind. She was even on the verge of starting to feel guilty about deceiving the Tejon family. But Rio had become completely captivated by the story of Maggie and Tejon. She couldn't help herself. All she wanted to do was learn more about the couple's ill-fated romance. Then there was that thing with the pictures up in Virginia City, as well as the remarkable incident on the boulder up at Lake Tahoe. And it was all topped off by the way she freaked out at the site where Maggie and Tejon died. Somewhere, in the dark recesses of her mind, Rio got that there were strange things happening to her. But she was much too consumed with the tragic love story to let her brain flag the mysterious peculiarities as a problem. Part 4. The Reunion. Chapter 22. Maggie and her sisters grew up on their grandfather's farm in Central California. Their father had run off when her mother was pregnant with Mary. At the time, Maggie was 6 and Molly was 3.
As a result, Maggie was the only one who had any real memories of their father. Their mother died of a fever when Maggie was 10. Being the eldest, it was put upon her to take on part of the responsibilities for her younger sisters right alongside her grandfather. But things had changed. Maggie was all grown up, and Molly was dead. Carrying on without Molly was one of the hardest undertakings Maggie and Mary would ever face. They weren't weak women, though, so they mourned their sister and then got on with the business of living. The first few weeks back home were pure hell for Maggie. She missed Tejon something fierce. It was hard not talking to him or seeing his smile or feeling his touch. Lost and alone, she was sure she was destined to live a lifetime of emptiness. Then something wonderful happened. Like a gift from heaven, she discovered she was pregnant. She saw the baby as a gift from God, sent specifically to help ease the pain of her loss. In February of 1864, Maggie gave birth to a baby boy she named Tejon, after his father. Because her own father had disappeared from her life, not a day went by that she didn't feel guilty for depriving her son of his father. She missed Tejon so much that her misery was like a steel weight. But every time she looked into her baby's eyes, the child did help to ease the sorrow, if only a little bit. While Maggie had spent the entire winter preparing for the birth of her child, Tejon had spent it trying to get over losing her. He hadn't had much success. The thing that had made it so hard was he was trapped. During the winter months, the mountainous terrain was harsh on the tribe. Every year, as the fall brought on cooler weather, people began their preparations for the unforgiving snowbound winter to come. The entire camp would pack up, disperse, and move down into the valley areas along the Nevada side of the lake. Trekking over that mountain wasn't an option during the winter. By the time spring broke and the snow had eased up in the hills, Tejon had talked himself into going after Maggie. He'd made up his mind. He was either going to bring her back here to live with him among his people, or they would strike out on their own. But either way, they'd be together, and she'd be back where she belonged, with him. On a spring day in April, when baby Tejon was about 2 months old, Maggie was outside tending to the task of hanging out the freshly washed laundry in the warm California sun. Several rows of clothing, including baby articles and sheets, swayed in the wind. Maggie was among the rows of laundry, hanging the wash up on the line. Baby Tejon cooed in the basket on the ground next to her. She looked at him and smiled. "Hi, sweetie," she crooned. "Are you having a good time outside with Mama?" The baby had been Maggie's saving grace. If God hadn't seen fit to bless her with this beautiful baby boy, she would have never been able to get over the heartbreak of losing Tejon. Her sister, Mary, had been out in the garden gathering vegetables. Heading back toward the house, she was the first to see the Indian on horseback riding their way. She did a quick scan of the horizon and felt a measure of relief that he appeared to be alone. "Maggie!" She kept her voice low and calm. Maggie peered out over the line of laundry and gasped at the sight of the figure off in the distance. She knew it was Tejon. She looked down at the baby and said with a smile, "Your daddy's here." Emerging from the clothesline maze, she headed out to meet him. At first, she took casual steps, but that didn't last long, as her need to be in his arms got the better of her. Tossing her pride aside, she ran to him. Tejon slid off his horse and rushed toward her, swinging her into the circle of his arms. He was overcome with a long-awaited sense of relief. When her tears fell, he kissed them away. "You're here," she whispered, caressing the length of his hair. "I can't believe you're here." Maggie's cheeks warmed as he pressed his lips against hers. But before giving in to her powerful need to get lost in him, she managed to break the spell. "I have someone I want you to meet." She contained her enthusiasm as she tugged at his hand, leading him back toward the house. They strolled together, arm in arm, not seeing or caring about anything but each other. Approaching the clotheslines, she clutched his hand tighter and led him into the maze. The baby was still resting quietly in the basket where she'd left him. She picked him up and turned to Tejon. "This is your son." "My son?" Tejon's words were in English, and they came weaker than he'd anticipated. But that didn't stop him from taking the baby and embracing him with the security of his arms. "My son!" He peered down at him. "You and my son will return with me," he said to Maggie, while still gazing at the baby. "Yes." Maggie's answer was delivered quickly and with certainty. "We'll go with you, but I want to wait until my grandfather returns. Will you stay here with me until he gets back?" Tejon's smile seemed to reach out and caress her cheek. He pulled her to him and pressed his lips to hers with a sweet, gentle kiss. "You give him name?" "Like his father," she said. "His name is Tejon." That didn't make much sense to Tejon. As far as he could see, the child needed his own identity. It wasn't his custom to label a child as an extension of oneself. Even so, he agreed, because that's what Maggie wanted. If naming their son after him made her happy, then he was more than willing to accommodate her. He simply chalked the naming practice up to another one of the white man's crazy ways. Maggie's eyes flew open. There was nothing but complete silence and darkness. Emerging from her slumber, she realized she was in her bed. The next lucid insight was that Tejon wasn't there with her. She sprang up, trying to recall some little something to prove that his arrival hadn't been a dream. Scanning the room, she saw him sleeping peacefully on the floor. She pulled a couple of blankets down onto the floor and made herself a pallet. Pulling another quilt off the bed, she snuggled up next to him and spread the cover over them. Tejon stirred. His eyes remained closed as a smile curled on the corners of his mouth. He slid his arm around her. "I am sorry." He opened his eyes. "The white man's bed is much soft." Maggie laid her finger against his lips. "Shh, doesn't matter. You're here now, and that's all that matters." She kissed him with a hunger that contradicted her outward calm. "I could not stay away." The caress of his lips sent the pit of her stomach into a wild swirl. "You promise me." His voice hardened. "You will not leave me again." Maggie giggled. "You may live to regret that someday." Her head fit perfectly in the hollow between his shoulder and neck. "Death is the only thing that will ever take me away from you again." Chapter 23. Bradford Fuller returned the next day. Maggie and Mary greeted him on the back porch and coaxed him with a gentle reverence into the living room. As soon as his gaze fell upon Tejon, anxiety flickered on his face like a candle's flame sputtering in the wind. Maggie fidgeted. Her grandfather was going to object to her returning to the tribe with Tejon. She didn't want to go against him, but she didn't have the strength to leave Tejon again. Bradford didn't have anything against Tejon personally. As a matter of fact, he liked him very well. The issue was not Tejon's heritage. He couldn't get past the feeling that Maggie would be found out up there, so close to the scene of the crime and Molly's death. If a traitor got a look at her, he'd associate her with the woman killed during the bank robbery because Maggie and Molly looked so much alike. It was a short step from there to realizing she was one of Molly's accomplices. "Tejon." Bradford made sure his tone kept to an even keel. "How are your parents?" "They are good," Tejon said in English. "I must say," Bradford paused to rein in his concern, which could easily end up sounding like intolerance if he wasn't careful. "I'm rather surprised to see you here." Tejon straightened his stature. "I come for my wife." "Look, Tejon, I got nothing against you." An anguished tone accompanied Bradford's words. "Under different circumstances, I'd be honored to have you as my grandson-in-law, but being anywhere near her," he pointed to Maggie, "puts you in great danger, and I think too much of you and your parents to let it happen." "If I die tomorrow, it will be worth it." He looked at Maggie, and a smile touched his mouth. "Just to be with her today." Maggie had been silent up until now. "With all due respect, grandfather, Tejon and I have discussed the consequences of our actions," she said. "And in the end, we'd rather risk discovery than live apart. And I won't keep him away from his son any longer." "All right." Bradford sensed that further argument was useless. He gave in, although against his better judgment. "It sounds like you've already made up your minds." He glanced back and forth between them. "I won't stand in your way." He gave them a smile that was backed by misgivings. "You have my blessings." In truth, Bradford had a lot of objections, but his eldest granddaughter had inherited a great deal of the Fuller stubbornness. She'd made up her mind, and there'd be no talking her out of what she was hell-bent on doing. And now there was the baby involved. Every child deserved to have both a mother and a father. Bradford had seen firsthand what his son's running off had done to Maggie and her sisters, so with a bit of reluctance he wished the couple well. Bradford sat at the head of the table with Mary and Maggie on either side of him, and Tejon beside Maggie. Tejon found the white man's chair to be as unnerving as their bed. "My big regret is that we weren't able to recover Molly's body and give her a proper burial." Maggie's eyes moistened with tears. The white man's burial practices, another custom that Tejon didn't understand. But it was important to Maggie. She'd expressed concern over it just last night, wondering what her mother and her sister would think of the lack of a funeral for her sister. "Is there no way to find out what happened to her?" "We made inquiries, but nothing's ever come of it." Bradford shook his head. "My guess is that she was buried at the back of the cemetery in Carson City, or maybe they took her out to Chinatown. That wouldn't surprise me." The uncertainty of Molly's plight seemed to slice through Mary, rattling her shoulders. She let out a muffling sound that faded away before she asked, "What do you want to do about the gold and silver we buried?" "Get me a pencil and some paper," Maggie said. Mary reached for the bureau behind her and came back to the table with the items Maggie had requested. Maggie scribbled on one side of the paper under the dim glow of an oil lamp. She stopped and looked at her handiwork, and then folded the paper over and over and drew a likeness of the area where she and her sisters had buried the treasure. She unfolded the paper and ripped it in half. Glancing up with a smile, she handed half to Mary. The map was Maggie's token of assurance that she wouldn't make an attempt to reclaim the treasure without her sister. "Next summer," Maggie said to Mary, "I want you to come to the lake. Grandfather will show you where, and we'll go get the treasure." "Better yet," Mary said, "why don't you dig it up and bring me my half? If I never step foot in that place again, it won't bother me a bit." Maggie looked at Tejon, and he nodded his approval. She turned back to Mary. "All right. Next summer we'll bring you your half." Chapter 24. Tejon and Maggie approached the tribal campsite on horseback. She carried the baby in a cradle board on her back. Chatter quickly buzzed through the encampment, bringing everyone out to greet the couple. Tomeko and Layla appeared from inside their lodge. Upon seeing Tejon and Maggie, Tomeko flashed a concerned look at his son. Layla's face spread into a genuine smile. Tejon slid off his horse easily and helped Maggie down. He unstrapped the baby from the cradle board on Maggie's back. Scooping the baby into his arms, he moved toward his parents. "Father, Mother," he spoke in the Washoe's native language, "this is my son." Layla took the baby and cradled him in her arms. Looking down at her grandson, she smiled and then let her gaze travel back to her husband's. "You see it, don't you?" "Yes," Tomeko nodded. She looked at Maggie. "He looked like Tejon as baby." Tomeko focused on Maggie. "You stay," he said in English. "Leave no more." "Sir?" Maggie swallowed over the lump in her throat. "I'll never go anywhere without Tejon, ever again." Things would have been fine if it hadn't been for that trapper, Trader John, happening upon the Washoe camp on a fine summer's day a couple of months later. Maggie had adapted easily and quickly to wearing the Indian garb once again. Still, the white man's scenic drawings enticed her. She wasn't alone. The stranger's pictures had drawn the attention of several tribe members, including Tejon. "Are you the artist?" Maggie asked the trader. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I am." "Do you paint, too?" "Yes, as a matter of fact, I do." "Could you paint me?" She pointed to herself, then Tejon. "And my husband?" "Yes, I can," he nodded. "If the price is right." Maggie smiled to herself. There was no way the trader's price was going to be more than she had. She had the money from the bank robbery in Carson City. Even though Tejon had been against the idea of having his and Maggie's paintings done, he thought it would somehow capture his soul and lock it inside his likeness on the canvas. Maggie had wanted it, and he found saying no to her difficult. The couple ended up with two fine-looking portraits. Maggie surveyed the paintings with extreme pleasure. Once she was able to tear her gaze away from Tejon's portrait, she turned to the trader. "Sir, I cannot thank you enough." She fanned her hand in front of the paintings. "They're beautiful." Trader John stared at Maggie with a curious eye. "Payment of the agreed-upon fee will be thanks enough." Maggie offered him a pouch containing gold coins. He snatched up the small bag and dumped the contents into his hand. Coins spilled into his palm. He glanced back at her and grinned. "Thank you kindly." After collecting his bounty, Trader John wasted no time in heading for Carson City. He was looking for a poker game and a good stiff drink. It had been a long time since he'd had enough money to back both his obsessions. Finally, he was certain he'd have the luck he so richly deserved. Tying his horse to the post outside the saloon, he headed for the door with an air of confidence that was typically foreign to him. About to enter the establishment, which he figured would reward his good fortune, he stopped abruptly, eyeing the wanted poster hanging outside the entrance. A crude drawing of a girl, who looked a lot like the white woman he'd painted up at the lake, seemed to stare out at him from the announcement. The thing that spoke to him the most was that it offered a $500 reward for any known associates. Could things possibly get any better for him? Trader John rubbed his chin and smiled. He turned and hurried across the street, giggling as he entered the sheriff's office. The sheriff looked up from his desk, but Trader John's attention was drawn past him and directly up to the wanted poster on the wall behind the lawman.
"That's her,"
he exclaimed, pointing to the poster.
"I seen her the other day."
The sheriff's face skewed into a shrewd look, and then he twisted around, glancing over his shoulder.
"Well, that'd be kind of hard."
He turned back to look at Trader John.
"Unless you're in the habit of seeing ghosts."
He gave him a swift chuckle and a stern glare.
"She's dead."
His words seemed to fall around Trader John like dust settling from a sandstorm.
"But she did have a couple of accomplices, and that's who we are looking for." "I'm telling you, Sheriff,"
he gestured toward Lake Tahoe,
"there's a woman up at the lake with them Indians, and she looks like that woman there."
He gave the wanted poster a nod. The sheriff drew a breath and slanted his mouth with a crooked frown.
"Maybe they're sisters."
He shrugged.
"All right. I'll gather up a posse and we'll check it out."
The sheriff pushed himself up from his desk.
"What about the reward?"
Trader John asked.
"If it turns out that you're right,"
the sheriff said conditionally, making his way around the desk,
"you'll get your reward." "All 500?
"All 500. The sheriff's assurance was accompanied by soft laughter. Part 5. The Awakening. Chapter 25. Billy let out a sigh as he glanced at Rio. They were in his living room. The pizza box was empty, and they weren't any closer to finding their way to the treasure.
"So,"
she cut her eyes toward him,
"how are we going to figure out where the treasure is?"
"Well, at this point, the map, even in its entirety, is absolutely no help at all."
"Billy,"
her tone sobered,
"we could spend the rest of our lives digging up random spots and never come close to finding the right place."
"Then we'd better find another way. I'm all out of ideas." As far as she was concerned, Turner's goons were the least of their worries. She knew how to deal with them. What she didn't know how to deal with was the fact that she and Billy couldn't figure out where to look for the treasure. Not to mention all the weird stuff that had been going on since she'd arrived in Carson City. Billy sat silently for a time. When he finally did speak, it was with a bit of hesitancy.
"There might be a way,"
he said with a hint of secrecy.
"But it's kind of unorthodox."
"How unorthodox?"
"It involves ingesting a controlled substance."
"Maybe you better spell it out for me." "There's a ritual that's practiced by many Native Americans, not so much around here," he said, "but I do understand that great results can come from it."
"Okay."
She hated being teased.
"The suspense is killing me. Out with it."
"It's called a vision quest. You have a better chance of actually experiencing one, though, if you use peyote." He looked at her, much too calmly for what he was suggesting. "Or so I'm told."
"Peyote."
She rolled her eyes and couldn't help laughing. "Well, let's run right on down to the corner drugstore and grab—" She threw her hands in the air. "How much did you say we'll need?" Her fixed eyes glared at him.
"Are you nuts?"
"I think I know somebody who knows somebody." His voice was so calm that it surprised even him, considering what he was suggesting. "I think we can get some."
"You're serious, aren't you? At this point?"
He shrugged, feeling defeated.
"I have no clue how to find that treasure."
"Could you maybe elaborate a bit?" She looked deep into his eyes, as if she'd find a reason inside them to hop on board with his crazy plan. "Give me some idea about what we'd be in for if we decided to go through with this." "Well, we'd need to go somewhere up in the hills or something so we wouldn't be disturbed," he said, making it up as he went along. "Then we'll take the peyote and wait." "Wait? Wait for what?" "Your vision. Sometimes it starts out as your worst fears confronting you." He cut his eyes toward her. "But eventually a spirit guide will join you." "Really?" There was so much skepticism in her tone that, were it tangible, it would have been dripping out of the corners of her mouth. "And you think this spirit guide is going to tell us where the treasure is?" "Well, if we get lucky enough to have Maggie or Tejon as a guide." The confidence in his tone diminished, and his voice trailed off. But that mattered little to Rio. Her thoughts were elsewhere, centered totally around Tejon. Was it possible? Was there a chance that Tejon could be her guide? Well, hell, Billy should have said so in the first place. She didn't need to hear anything more to induce her to throw caution to the wind. Now she was ready and willing to partake of illegal drugs in the hope of catching another glimpse of Tejon. Chapter 26. Having the option of peyote dumped in her lap, and the thought of a visit from Tejon had filled her with anticipation and left her tossing and turning. Her inability to get a good night's rest brought out an unwelcome dream about her past. Rio's past, not Maggie's. At the age of 8, her father had sat her down one afternoon after she got home from school and broke the news to her. Her mother had left them. Shocked. Rio sat there for the longest time, thinking maybe it was a joke and her father was going to take it back. Not necessarily because she wanted her mother to stick around. More to the point, she was afraid her father would blame her. She didn't want him to get mad at her and go away too. But her father didn't take it back. "Daddy, did Mommy leave because of me?" If it was her fault, she wanted to know that right away. She figured that must certainly be the case. Even at the age of 8, she knew how much her mother hated her. But what she didn't know was why. She'd tried so hard. She'd attempted anything and everything she could think of to please her mother. But nothing Rio ever did seemed to make any difference to her mother. "No, honey," her father reassured her in the softest of comforting voices. "It wasn't because of you." "Is she coming back?" she asked. But deep down inside, Rio knew she wasn't. "No, honey." Her father cleared his throat. "She's not coming back." Silent tears fell from her eyes, but they weren't for the mother she'd lost. She was just thankful her father wasn't mad at her. And should the truth be known, if he didn't mind that her mother was gone, then neither did she. What was to miss about the spiteful attitude? Chapter 27. Billy had a serious look on his face as he entered the house through the front door, carrying a brown paper bag. Rio was on her feet before he'd made it halfway across the room. "You get it?" "Yeah." He nodded and laid the bag on the coffee table. "He said we shouldn't do it alone, so I guess we should have someone watching out for us while we're under the influence." "So," Rio struggled to breathe around the lump clogging her throat, "I'm supposed to trust a complete stranger to not only look out for me—" She tried reasoning it out so she could convince herself it was something that was okay to do. "But also not to invade my personal well-being while I'm out of my mind?" Her thoughts barely made it out in her shaky voice. "Do you trust me?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes." "Then you're going to have to trust me when I tell you that I'd never consciously place you in danger." There was so much determination in his eyes that she almost believed it. "If you want to continue looking for the treasure, this is the only hope we have." The only hope? That's it? They were out of options? And then there was the warrior. She definitely wasn't going to see him any other way, unless she died, and she didn't want to go there. "Okay." Rio changed her tune quickly. "What's next?" She wanted to find the treasure, and she needed to see Tejon. She couldn't explain it or even understand it entirely, but somehow she felt her life depended upon seeing him again. Billy and Rio sat across from his parents at the elder Tejon's dining room table. He explained their plan, while Rio tried to ignore the paintings of Maggie and Tejon, mostly Tejon. It felt like they were staring down on her. "Billy," the senior Tejon shook his head, "I don't see how I can be a party to this. You're talking about performing a ritual that neither I nor your mother approve of." "Dad, Rio and I are going to do this thing with or without your support," he said. "What I'm asking of you is that you and Mom be there for us when we do it. I need to know that you'll be there to take care of Rio." Bill studied his son for a moment. He'd never seen Billy quite so dedicated to anything. Oh, sure, he was a hard worker, and he had always done a great job of taking care of himself. But this was different. Bill decided that maybe his sister's daughter coming into their lives, even though she did have an uncanny resemblance to their ancestor, was perhaps the best thing that could have happened to Billy. His son had always had more than his share of love showered upon him from the family. But that didn't stop Billy from feeling isolated. No one else in the family had white skin, until Rio happened upon them. "You and Rio have bonded." It was a realization for Bill more than anything else. "You could say that," Billy said with a half nod, his trademark and unconscious gesture when he was trying to play it cool. "I feel a certain kinship with Rio." He looked at his mother. "She is, after all, my cousin." In the end, Bill and Carol had reluctantly agreed to accompany Billy and Rio on their mission. Even so, after the kids had left, Bill was having trouble with the idea of summoning a spirit guide to help them find the treasure. He had been, and still was, pacing the length of the living room, while Carol sat nearby on the couch. "What will you do?" she asked, hands folded in her lap. Bill stopped. "I really don't have a choice." He glanced at his wife. "Do I?" "Actually, yes, you do," she challenged him. "You can either do it or not." Her summation made it sound so simple. "Well, unfortunately, what I can't do is tell our son what to do anymore." With that notion, he started pacing again. "I don't want him to do this thing, but he's clearly made up his mind. And I can't send our son and my sister's daughter out there to do this alone. This thing might turn out to be their worst nightmare." "Then again," Carol said, "maybe they'll find what they're looking for." Chapter 28. Across the Washoe lands, specific areas had been deemed divine locations long ago and were still widely recognized as sacred sites for conducting consecrated ceremonies. The Tejans had adopted to follow tradition and use one of those sites in their attempt to induce a vision quest. After selecting Hot Springs Mountain, Rio, Billy, his parents, and several tribal members, Billy's most trusted friends, headed out in jeeps and pickups because the ride was off-road. They climbed the mountain for more than half an hour after leaving the last remnants of a would-be trail. Arriving at their destination, everyone emerged from the vehicles simultaneously. The black SUV following the party had not gone unnoticed. Carol approached Billy. "What about those men following us?" "They want what we're after." Billy shook his head.
I doubt they'll bother us until we find it."
The group set up camp in a clearing snuggled securely within a wooded area at the top of the mountain. In no time they had several tents pitched and then began concentrating on forming a 5-foot circle made of rocks. In the center, they dug a fire pit. They'd brought firewood with them, and a couple of the guys began unloading it from one of the trucks. Rio stood alone, leaning against Billy's Jeep. In her preoccupied state, she was a bit apprehensive about their plans, but she was doing a good job of hiding it. She wanted so badly for Tejon to show up in her vision, but she was afraid she wanted it too much. Rio had learned a long time ago not to want things. When you want things, you're vulnerable. She knew nothing good could come from this, but still, she longed to see Tejon. By the time the sun drifted behind the mountains, a fire was blazing in the pit. Rio might have found the mountain's summit spooky if she hadn't been so anxious and preoccupied. A distinct chill had settled around her, so she grabbed a blanket from the Jeep and headed toward the fire. She stepped over the rocks, entering the sacred circle, and methodically laid out her blanket near the fire. "God, I'm so hungry," her stomach grumbled as she sat down. Billy was already sitting on the bare ground on the other side of the fire. "Sorry, dear," he chuckled. "Your dinner is limited tonight." "How come we can't have any food?" It wasn't so much a question as a complaint. "Don't you know anything about fasting?" "Apparently not." "So what happens if I can't hold this stuff down?" Rio asked. "From what I understand," Billy said, almost laughing, "it'd be really surprising if you did." The farther the sun sank behind the mountains surrounding Lake Tahoe, the cooler the temperatures dipped on the mountaintop. Even so, no one but Billy and Rio were allowed inside the sacred circle unless the fire needed tending. Whenever it did, Bill stepped cautiously over the rock border, but only long enough to fuel the blaze with more firewood. Once he'd done that, he'd step back out, just as carefully as he'd stepped in. To avoid as much outside contamination as possible, they stoked the fire prior to the ingestion of the peyote. The others lingered outside the circle while Billy and Rio choked down about a dozen buttons between the two of them. Soon, less than half an hour later, Rio wasn't feeling so hot. She stretched out on the blanket and let out a whimpering moan. "Oh my God, I think I'm going to be sick." Rio's words trailed off. Carol set a bucket at Rio's side without stepping inside the circle. Rio pushed up from the ground and latched onto the bucket with barely enough time to pull it to her lap before she started vomiting. Carol passed a moist towel to Rio. "You okay, Rio?" Bill asked calmly. "Yeah," she muttered. Billy glanced through the fire at Rio. He wished he could go to sleep. Maybe that way he could ward off the nasty feeling in the pit of his stomach. He wondered briefly if it had been rocks instead of peyote that he'd eaten. Then the sickening sensation emerged and crept up his chest. He gagged and grabbed the bucket someone had placed at his side. Rio dropped down onto the blanket again and curled up. She closed her eyes and drew her hands up, using them as a pillow. Billy sat cross-legged on the bare ground, staring mindlessly into the fire. His eyes had dried up from a lack of moisture. They stung. He lowered his head, closed his eyes, and rubbed his eyelids. After what seemed like an eternity, at least for Billy, he opened them back up and looked around. He was no longer sitting by the fire. Now he was standing on the edge of a jagged cliff. From out of nowhere, Tejon effortlessly climbed up from the side of the ridge. "Hello, Billy," he said with a smile.
Tehan's greeting came in perfect English. "Is this a dream?" Billy asked. Taking a peek over the edge, he saw nothing but a straight drop into darkness that seemed to go on forever. "How'd you do that?" He looked back at Tehan. Billy's newfound cousin was at Tehan's side, but she was dressed in Indian garb. "Rio?" "Close." The girl shook her head. "But no." She giggled. "Well, actually, that's not altogether true. We are, after all, one and the same. But I'm here as Maggie." "You and Rio are the same person?" The ability to be shocked or surprised by this episode was just beyond Billy's reach, and so was the knowledge that he had achieved his goal. He was in the midst of a vision quest. "We share the same soul," Maggie said. Tehan cleared his throat. "There are two things I need to tell you," he said to Billy. "First, you need to stop hating the color of your skin. Be proud of who and what you are. Secondly, you need to stop blaming Maggie for my death." His tone softened as his eyes drifted to her. "She died too." "But if it wasn't for her," Billy said, "you wouldn't have died." "My life was short." Tehan's eyes were still on Maggie, and his whole face had broken into a smile. "But it was worth 1,000,000 lifetimes." His smile faded as he turned back to Billy. "It was my destiny to protect her. It was also my destiny to die with her." Billy stared at Maggie. Her resemblance to Rio was uncanny. Every curl of her fiery hair, every curve defining her face, every sparkle in her jade-green eyes. He'd never seen anything like it, a resemblance so striking, and he couldn't get over it. "I have to go," Tehan said to Billy. "But before I do, there's something I want to show you." Without any warning at all, Tehan stepped inside Billy's body. Billy gasped at the jolt. Somehow, he thought he now knew what it felt like to be struck by lightning. Billy's body jerked when Tehan stepped back out. "I have to go now," he said again. "But don't worry, Maggie's going to keep you company for a while. Who knows? Maybe she can help you." Tehan faded away. "Where'd he go?" Billy asked in an almost whisper. Maggie stepped up and motioned for him to sit with her. They dropped down onto the ledge and dangled their feet over the edge of the cliff. There was a distinct silence between them for the longest time, and then, finally, Billy mustered up the courage to look at her. The resemblance was uncanny. It was so weird. He reached up and traced his fingertips along the edge of her hair with a hesitant touch. Maggie shivered. Billy yanked his hand back. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. But you look so much like her." "It's okay." She looked at him. "I haven't been touched in such a long time." Tears glistened the corners of her eyes. "What?" His mind whirled at her declaration. "You and Tehan can't touch each other?" "No." She shook her head. "Heaven isn't so heavenly when you can't feel the touch of the one you love." "I'm sorry." The words fell from his mouth, and he meant them. "He showed you, didn't he?" Maggie asked, changing the subject. "How much he loves me," she added, and it was no question. "Yeah," Billy shrugged. "In a way, I envy you two." "Why?" "Because you have each other.
You may not be able to touch, but you're always going to love each other, apparently." "Well, that's true," she nodded. "But there's someone out there for you, too." "Yeah, sure." His skeptical laughter filled the air. "It's true." Maggie grinned and nudged him. "And between you and me, she's coming very soon." Billy might have inquired about her statement if the reason he was there hadn't slammed into the forefront of his mind. It consumed his thoughts, pushing everything else aside. "Is the treasure real?" "Oh, it's real, all right," Maggie said. "All you have to do is find it." "But how?" he asked. "We don't even know where to look." "Well, I can't really help you with that," she said. "I don't exactly recall where we buried it." A sense of defeat dropped over Billy. "Well, I guess that settles it," he said with a shrug. "We can't figure out how to read your map." "Now that is something I can help you with." She smiled. "You must be careful, though." Her tone grew serious. "There are people out there who are after the same thing you are, and above all else, you must protect Rio, because Tejon is not able to do that right now." She hopped up off the ground, and Billy did the same. He pulled the map out of his pocket and handed it to her. She folded the edges several times, creased it down the middle, and then handed it back to Billy. "Will this help?" he asked, taking the map from her. "Compare it as is to an early map of the area, and you'll know where to look," she said with a comforting pat on the back of his hand. Her expression turned somber. "There will come a time when Rio's identity will be questioned. Never doubt for a moment that she isn't who she says." Billy didn't give Maggie's counsel about Rio much consideration. He was too wrapped up in the map and the way she'd folded it. "I have to go now." She backed away in slow, easy steps. "But leave Rio alone for the night. Tejon is with her." She began to fade away, leaving him with one last consideration. "Remember, you must protect Rio." And then she was gone. The sun had long since disappeared behind the Sierra Nevada mountains, and Rio was wandering aimlessly through the forest. Somewhere, in the deepest corners of her mind, she knew she was asleep, high upon a mountaintop, and curled up by a warm fire. It was a notion she couldn't quite grasp, but yet she knew it. Maybe that's why it hadn't fazed her that it was dark and she was alone in the woods. She continued on, somehow knowing which way to go, even though she had no clue where she was going, until she arrived at Vista Point. That was a place she recognized, having recently been there with Billy. She climbed up on a boulder and drew her knees up under her chin. Not long after, she heard a noise in the nearby bushes. It didn't bother her. She felt no fear, just curiosity. "Is someone there?" Tejon emerged from the shadows. "It's you!" Hope and anticipation pushed the sigh up in her throat. Tejon strolled toward her and scaled the rock easily, sitting beside her, his arms swept against hers. The heat of his skin breezed through her, igniting a flame that had been smoldering for decades. He looked at her and smiled. He brushed her hair back from her face and traced his fingertips along her cheek. "My dear, sweet love." His dark-eyed gaze stoked the desire burning deep inside her. "I have missed you so," he said in perfect English. Their closeness was like a drug, filling her with euphoria. What the hell? Rio slid off the rock and started to run. This was so not right. She'd lost her mind. He was there, all around her, and in an instant he'd swept her effortlessly into his arms. She wanted to run, flee, but her heart jolted, and her pulse pounded from the feel of his bare-chested skin. He drew her like a powerful magnet, and she was helpless to escape the attraction. The sweet smell from the other day, when Billy had left her here alone, invaded the space around her and overwhelmed her senses. She felt like she was overdosing on some euphoric drug. She slid her arms around him, wanting another dose. He brushed his lips over her cheek. Her body tingled from the contact, and her heart danced with excitement. Rio wanted every inch of him. But he was not hers. Tehan's lips were well on their way to meeting up with hers when she pulled away. "We shouldn't be doing this." She should put some distance between them, but it was hard to push him away. Maggie. She closed her eyes, feeling utterly miserable. "You belong to her." He pulled her to him and locked his hands against her spine. "You haven't quite figured it out yet, have you?" His gaze traveled over her face and searched her eyes. He leaned in to kiss her, and the heat of his lips seared emotions and passions back into her heart that she'd long since forgotten. Feelings from another lifetime that lingered to this day. Rio shook her head, as if that had cast out the weird sensations. "What the hell is going on?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Looking at her, he said, "You remember now." A burst of wild grief shot through her. Rio felt her head grow dizzy and her knees give. Tehan scooped her into his arms before she could fall and carried her through the darkness. She buried her face against the side of his neck. An odd feeling, like she'd found something she didn't know she'd lost, gained momentum as they came to a lodge in the middle of a thicket. Inside, Rio made a feeble attempt at pulling herself together. "How could I have forgotten you?" she asked, aching with an inner pain. Tehan stepped forward and clasped her body tightly to his. "You weren't supposed to remember," he said. "At least that was the plan when you were given a new life in the form of Rio. All traces of Maggie were supposed to have been stripped away." Realizing what that inevitably meant, she put all her effort into freeing herself from his embrace and took a couple of steps back. "So?" She hesitated, finding it hard to speak the truth. "You know the whole story then, don't you?" "Yes," he said without judgment. "But you have to change your plans." "To what?" "You have to help Billy. He's family." "Look," fear chased her guilt up her throat, "I'm having a little trouble considering someone who turns out to be my 20 millionth great-grandson from a former life as being family." "Rio," Tehan said softly, "Audrey Tehan is your mother." "No, she's not." Rio shook her head. "That's just a cover." "Cover or not," he caressed her cheek with his thumb, "it's true." She swallowed hard, lifted her head, and met his gaze head on. "I remember my mother, and she definitely wasn't Audrey Tehan." Audrey was your father's first wife and your natural mother. Tejon wondered if Rio really needed to hear that she'd been abandoned by not just one, but two mothers. Abby is only your adoptive mother. He wanted nothing more than to be able to protect her, even from this. Maybe that's why she's always hated you so. Rio closed her eyes. Oh, God. She let out a sound that was half sob, half moan. My great-great-granddaughter from a previous life turns out to be my mother. She opened her eyes, looking at him with fear and disbelief evident in her gaze. Do you realize how much therapy I'm going to need over this? Tejon took her hand and gave her a sad, lonely smile. You have to forget your original purpose and find a way to help Billy, he said. If you can do that, then in the end, your original purpose will be served. But we don't know where the treasure's buried. Billy has the necessary information now. Tejon paused, holding her gaze for a moment, and then leaned over and kissed her, madly, decadently, passionately. The next thing she knew, they were tucked away inside a cozy pallet made of bearskin. His lips were pressed against hers, and he was caressing her mouth more than kissing it. The heat of his naked body against her bare skin burned hot and seared deep inside, into the core of her soul. Their reunion had been a long time coming, and neither of them wanted it to end quickly. They took things slow and very sensual. Becoming reacquainted, they welcomed each other home. When their passions exploded in a downpour of fiery sensations, their bodies melded together as if they were two pieces of a whole. Rio nestled against Tejon, savoring the feeling of satisfaction he left her with. In his arms, fully contented, she fell asleep. At daybreak, the morning sun broke the horizon and filtered into the lodge through the cracks and crevices, waking Rio. Waking up in Tejon's arms gave her about a moment's worth of pleasure, until she realized what that meant. I don't want to go back, she said, savoring the warmth of his body against her bare skin. I want to stay here with you. You have to go back. With an almost hypnotic touch, he caressed her hair. This time, you will live a long, healthy, and very happy life. I can't do that now. Dissent rose in her voice. Not after last night. I know this is hard for you to accept or understand, he said. But your destiny is with your partner. Tejon propped himself up on one arm and trailed his fingers along her cheek. He smiled at her, and she wanted nothing more than to get lost in him again. Close your eyes, he whispered. She did as he asked. His fingers blazed a delightfully sensuous trail over her face. She touched his arm, enjoying the feel of his chiseled bicep. His lips breezed across her cheek. Don't look at it like it's forever, he whispered. Rio's hand fell against her own body. That's when she realized Tejon was gone. She was left with nothing but a memory. She leapt to her feet at the same time her eyes sprang open. Surveying the area and herself, she found she was fully clothed and back atop Hot Springs Mountain. Billy and the others rushed to her side. Rio, you okay? Anxiety fueled his questioning voice. Rio was beginning to understand how a deer caught in the headlights felt. She knew she should say something, but what? What could she say? I had sex with a dead guy, and worse yet, I wanted to stay with him? Huh. She came to the conclusion that it was best to keep her mouth shut. There was nothing she could say that would make sense, so she walked away. She heard Billy order, "Everybody stay back." She could easily guess he was following her as she headed out of the clearing, but it didn't stop her from hurrying through the thicket of trees until she'd reached the mountain's edge. In silence, she gazed out across the canyon. Billy stopped a few feet from her. "I can't imagine what you're going through right now." There was a measure of sympathy in his tone. Rio closed her eyes, caught momentarily by the recollection of Tejon's lips and tongue, making her body sing as it had never done before. Trying to shake the memory, a chill rushed through her. She took her time, looking at Billy. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." "Now I know why you got so spooked when I took you to the place where Tejon and Maggie died," Billy said, his tone calm. A touch of fear and a bit of disbelief passed across her face. "Let me guess. In your vision, Tejon came to you." He posed it as a question, but it wasn't really. "How do I know this?" he asked, not waiting for an answer. "Because Tejon and Maggie came to see me before he came to you." Rio's eyes glistened, and she skewed her mouth tightly. "I should never have come here." She sucked back her frustration. "I should never have done this." She took off again, and Billy chased after her. When he caught up to her, he grabbed her arm. "Rio," he said with newfound hope, "I know how to read the map. Maggie showed me." His tone grew solemn. "She also told me that you and she are one and the same." Rio paled, and it was like all reasoning drained from her face, right along with the color. She stared at him, and he saw the never-ending need to understand what was happening to her, glistening in her eyes. That's when he knew she'd gotten the same news. "Tejon told you that, didn't he?" Rio's scathing laughter rippled around him. "Oh, that ain't the half of it." Her head shook like a bobblehead doll. "The thing is, Billy," she flashed him a judgmental glare, "you and we took a controlled substance, one that induces hallucinations." She threw her hands in the air. "Are we really supposed to buy into the fantasies that we created last night? Because they were, after all, just that, illusions." "Vision, hallucination, fantasy, or illusion," he said, remaining calm. "Call it whatever you like, but I have just one question for you. If it wasn't real, how did you and I both come up with the idea that you and Maggie are the same person?" Chapter 29. Taylor and Biggs had worked for Turner Adkins a number of years. Their current assignment was out of the ordinary and not exactly their forte. They were used to doing intimidation and scare tactics to accomplish their goals. Being ordered to sit, wait, and watch was a first, and as it turned out, a mission that neither of them were good at. Even so, from a hilltop across the canyon, they watched the boss's ringer. Taylor peered through the binoculars as the party began to awaken. Biggs was on the phone with Atkins. "It's beyond me, boss." He rolled his eyes to keep from complaining about this farce of an assignment. "All they did was sit around a fire all night." He paused, listening to his boss. "They're packing up to leave." And after another brief interlude, Biggs said,
All right, boss. We'll stick to them like glue.
Chapter 30. Rio had to escape, at least for a little while, and she had to do it alone. She had to call her father. She needed answers, and she needed them now. In the Rayleigh's parking lot, she stowed away between two large trucks, feeling confident that somebody would have to be looking for her to sneak up on her. She left the engine running and fished her cell phone out of her bag. Rio hit the speed dial and tapped her hand against the steering wheel while she waited for James Larroquette to answer his phone. Finally, when she heard his voice on the other end of the call, relief washed over her. "Daddy."
"Rio?"
Her father's voice was filled with apprehension, which didn't surprise her. He could always pick up on her anxiety right away.
"Are you okay?"
"I'm fine, Daddy." She realized the lie as soon as it left her mouth. "Well, no." She straightened in her seat and cleared her throat. "That's not really true."
"Rio, honey, are you in trouble?"
"Daddy." She nearly choked on the lump crawling up her larynx. "Is Abby really my mother?"
"Why would you ask me that?"
Her father's tone went from apprehension to panic, suggesting that he'd been dreading this moment for a long time. "Well?" She held her breath, waiting. When he didn't say anything right away, she knew she'd have to give him a nudge. "It's recently been brought to my attention that a woman named Audrey Tejon might possibly be my mother." The tears turned on like a faucet at full blast. "Were you married to her, Daddy?" James Larroquette's silence reached across the wire and grabbed hold of Rio like a huge, suffocating strap. After the deafening stillness came the confirmation of her worst nightmare when her father said,
"How did you find out about Audrey?"
"Is she my mother?"
Rio screamed into the phone.
"Yes, Rio, she is."
She wept with fury, indignation, desolation, and sorrow. 4 little words had ripped her world apart. Now the childhood treatment that Abby had bestowed upon her made sense. In some weird way, that helped. When Rio's tears had tapered down to sniffles, James cleared his throat.
"Rio, honey."
As he spoke, she swiped the tears with the base of her palm.
"Do you want me to come there?"
"No!" The thought of her father coming to Carson City sent her senses reeling. That could not happen. "You cannot come here." From the time Audrey Tejon met James Larroquette and married him, and up until the time she met Turner Atkins, she hadn't changed much. Something happened to Audrey when, as a teenager, she ran away from home with Johnny Morton. Audrey was 16 and Johnny was 19. Her parents had been livid at the older boy chasing after their young daughter. Needless to say, Audrey was infatuated with Johnny. The more her parents tried to stop her from seeing him, the more she was determined to do just that. It didn't take much effort on Johnny's part to convince her to run away with him. The boy made grand promises of a wonderful, magical life together. The magic lasted less than a year. Johnny came home from work one day and announced that he'd been seeing someone else. To make matters worse, he was in love with the other woman. Without any remorse, he packed his things and left Audrey to fend for herself. She didn't dare go home, feeling a reconciliation between herself and her parents could never happen. After a brief period of wallowing in self-pity, Audrey pulled herself up off the ground and did whatever she had to do to take care of herself. That is how she acquired a taste for the finer things in life. One wild weekend in Vegas, when she was in her late 20s, she met a handsome young man named James Larroquette. Audrey was taken with his wholesome good looks and his unwavering focus. He knew exactly what he wanted and precisely how he was going to get it. And James was fascinated with the young Native American beauty. She had the most beautiful green eyes he'd ever seen.
James and Audrey married with the grandest of plans for the future. She spent the first year of their marriage waiting for the birth of their first child. She was also waiting for the other shoe to drop. She anticipated the same thing happening with James that happened with Johnny. By the time their little girl, Rio, was born, Audrey was miserable. She had to get out, and she had to do it right away. She knew James would never allow her to leave with the baby, so she did what she thought was the only option open to her. When Rio was 2 weeks old, Audrey went to the grocery store and never came home. James Larroquette knew his wife had gone to L.A. because that's the last place the credit card company told him she'd used the card before he had her cut off. After that, he never heard from Audrey again. Rio was less than a year old when James met Abigail McKenzie, a lovely young woman who appeared to love his daughter very much. He quickly decided that Abby would make a wonderful mother for Rio, so he wasted no time in asking her to marry him. Abby happily agreed to adopt Rio with the hope that they would give the child lots of brothers and sisters. They would have, too, if James hadn't gotten that awful fever right after the wedding, leaving him unable to father any more children. Well, that wasn't exactly what Abby had agreed to. She'd only resolved to adopt Rio with the understanding that she would be able to have her own children. Rio was a little over 3 when they finally discovered James was no longer capable of fathering children. That notion ate at Abby like a vicious disease, until she got to the point where she resented Rio and hated James because it was all his fault that she wasn't able to have her own children. Yet she was still stuck having to take care of his kid. James put up with it for a few years, hoping Abby would get over not being able to have her own children. She never did. Finally, after realizing it would be better for Rio to lose her mother than to have to continue with the one he'd stuck her with, he asked for a divorce. Rio hung silently on the other end of the wire. The story her father had relayed would have been almost unbelievable if she hadn't already heard the beginning of the tale from Tejon.
"Sweetheart, I know it doesn't mean much."
James Larroquette's voice was dripping with regret.
"But I never meant to hurt you."
"I know, Daddy,"
she said.
"You were just trying to protect me."
"I truly was."
"I know, Daddy."
Rio's tears escaped again.
"This is a lot to take in."
"Are you sure you don't want me to come there?"
"No, Daddy."
She nearly choked on her objection.
"You can't."
"Well, I know that tone,"
he said, half laughing.
"You're not in danger, are you?"
"No, Daddy, I'm not in any danger."
She even managed to crack a smile. Her father would be blown away if she told him where she was. More to the point, who she was with. Chapter 31. Billy found Rio sitting motionless on the couch in his living room. She had this blank look on her face. It was her shield against the world. But he had a pretty good idea about the chaos that was going on inside her right now. Who wouldn't be confused, considering? He eased down onto the couch. She didn't move. She didn't look at him. He gave her a little nudge. She finally looked at him with sad, sorrowful eyes. "You okay?" he asked, yet he knew the answer. It was clear, even with the stone-faced mask she wore to disguise her pain. She turned away and looked straight ahead before answering him with a soft, simple response.
"Sure."
Silence hung in the air between them, and Billy's mind had begun to fill with all kinds of worst-case scenarios when she looked back at him.
"My whole life turns out to be one big fat lie."
Her tone was as helpless as her feeble shrug.
"But sure."
She let out a weak smile and a wry laugh.
"I'm just hunky-dory."
The one thing Billy had noticed about Rio when he first met her was she had this fire that seemed to sparkle and crackle and shoot out from her eyes. But now, as he looked into those same eyes, the flame was gone. She appeared to be nothing more than an empty shell. Everything about her that had fueled her existence was now gone. It had flown right out the window. Billy knew, and she probably did too, that it wasn't coming back. Rio wanted to be somewhere else, with someone else. But for all the good it would do her, she might as well be 1,000,000,000,000 miles away from Tejon, because she could never get to him. "Do you want to quit?" he asked in a tone that offered more than questioned.
"No, I don't want to quit."
She shook her head.
"But I've got to try to figure out how I'm supposed to carry on with this life."
Her melancholy seemed to deepen.
"When I can't get past the last one." "Why don't you tell me everything that happened the other night?"
Billy said.
"And I don't mean a sugar-coated version. Give me full disclosure."
She appeared to be thinking about it, and then finally said,
"It's too wild for words."
Whatever had happened, she wasn't ready to talk about it. She threw him a quick, engaging look, one that said she was going to try to change the subject.
"What happened in your vision?"
God, he was good. Billy fought the smirk, trying to tip the corners of his mouth.
"I had a little chat with Tejon and Maggie. At first I thought she was you. She did tell me that you and she were one and the same."
He snuck a peek at her, knowing she was freaked out by the implication. But she had asked for details, and maybe that'd help her to reveal some of her own.
"Tejon didn't stay long, but he did tell me to stop hating the color of my skin, and to stop blaming Maggie for his death."
He fell silent, having to regroup after that.
"You know,"
he gave the room a quick scan,
"he showed me how much he loves her."
"You."
"He stepped inside my body, and I could actually see and feel what he feels."
He shook his head, and an eeriness rippled down into his body, shaking his shoulders.
"It was really weird, but after seeing and feeling what it's like to love someone that much,"
his tone carried an unmistakable quality,
"it made me realize how alone I really am."
He looked at Rio.
"That's when Maggie said something really strange."
"What?" Rio asked, totally engrossed in his story.
"She said there was someone out there for me too, and that she's coming very soon."
Billy didn't hide his bewilderment.
"Is that weird or what?"
"Everything else made sense, though, huh?" Billy thought about it.
"Yeah,"
he said.
"Granted, it was pretty much unbelievable, but it made perfect sense."
Well, except for that one thing about Rio's identity being questioned. But Billy was wrapped up in the possibility of his soulmate coming into his life. Now that he'd seen what it felt like to love someone with your whole heart, he wanted that more than anything, and he unconsciously tucked the obscure tidbit about Rio into the deepest corners of his mind.
"That is so weird. The same kind of thing happened to me," she said with a nod. "It was pretty much unbelievable, but I understood it all, except for this one thing Tejon said to me." "What?" "He said my destiny was with my partner."
She didn't understand that, and it showed. Rio had never had a partner in any shape, form, fashion, or capacity. In light of that, Tejon's statement confused the hell out of her. She'd been a loner for as long as she could remember. She liked it that way. She'd learned a long time ago that the only person she could count on was herself.
"Can you take me back up there?"
she asked, looking at Billy.
"Back to where they died?"
Suddenly, the locale and her reaction to it had new meaning.
"Yeah," he said. "But are you sure you want to go back there?"
"Yes." Billy parked the Jeep in the same place he had the last time they'd come to Clear Creek. Rio's nerves had had a healthy workout on the way over, and by now her heart was doing double time. He cut the engine, and she hopped out of the vehicle. She strode across the road and stopped at the hillside. Billy paused beside her. She peered down into the ravine, instantly mesmerized by the sound of the rushing waterfall and the spray misting her face. Something, a feeling she couldn't quite pinpoint, dragged her gaze upward to the steep cliffs looming above them. She stared at the ominous sight, her heart on the verge of exploding. The thought of Tejon losing his life here doused her with tremendous grief. She looked at Billy. He was standing beside her in an almost protective manner. She pointed to the cliffs towering above them and asked, "They jumped from up there?" She was more or less looking for confirmation. "Yes." Billy nodded and looked away. "Can you get me up there?" "Sure, I can get you up there." He buried his fingers in the front pockets of his Levi's. "Don't know that you'll like the getting part, but I can get you up there." "Good. Let's go." She spun on her heel and hurried back across the road. Billy followed her back to the Jeep. They drove to the other side of the mountain, and he stopped at the bottom, revving the engine. There was no road, or even the hint of a trail. From this angle, nothing but a bunch of sagebrush stood between them and the top. Rio got the feeling it was going to take a lot more than the state's shrub to stop Billy. He looked at Rio and winked. "You might want to hold on." He gunned the engine and charged his way up the hill. The Jeep trampled over the sagebrush, and Rio latched onto the dashboard.
Me and my bright ideas.
After a rip-roaring, bumpy ride, the Jeep skidded to a stop at the top of the mountain. Rio exited the vehicle, feeling herself being pulled inexplicably toward the cliffs. The closer she got to the edge, the more apprehension seemed to turn her legs to jelly. A couple feet from the rim, she dropped to the ground and drew her legs up under her chin. She draped her arms over her knees and stared out across the canyon. She knew Billy was feet, maybe inches, behind her. He was quiet, really quiet. She took advantage of the silence to do a little soul-searching, even if it was only for a second or two. The scenery was breathtaking. Even so, it wasn't enough. Nothing would ever be enough. Not ever again. Overcome with a sense of despondency, she dropped her head to her knees and cradled it in her arms. She felt Billy sitting down beside her. "You okay?" His inquiry came softly. She drew her head up and looked at him. "It's weird." She glanced out over the canyon and then landed her gaze back on Billy. "I don't have any solid memories of Maggie's life, but I have all the feelings that she felt for Tejon." She cast a brief glimpse toward the cliffs and then returned her attention to Billy. "Can you tell me what happened? How was it exactly that they came to die here?" Billy understood now why she needed to hear the story of Maggie and Tejon. It was her only connection to the love she'd lost forever. Part 6. The Bond. Chapter 32. Northern Nevada, Lake Tahoe area, September 1864. After hearing about the posse heading their way, Tejon and Maggie had left their only child and a few cherished tokens, his pouch, her necklace, their wedding bracelets, and their paintings, with Tejon's parents. He'd taken her high up into the hills. He had to hide her from the white sheriff and his band of vigilantes. It was the only way to keep her safe, if they didn't freeze to death first. The high forest was his best chance to evade the white man's posse. It was an area he knew well, but the lawmen would have trouble navigating or tracking them without help. The bad news was that, at such a high altitude, even in the summer, the nights were cold. Maggie shivered. The single blanket they shared for warmth did little to provide shelter from the bitter chill of an exceptionally cold night in the Sierra Nevada. But it was nothing compared to the noose at the end of a rope. Maggie Fuller's fate if they were caught. Protectively, Tejon tucked the blanket around her and reinforced his embrace.
"I am sorry," he said in English. "We can have no fire."
Exiled in total darkness, he hadn't dared build a fire for fear of discovery.
"It's okay." Maggie's voice trembled. "I'm not cold."
Of course, it was a lie. She was freezing. Still, it was better than the alternative. She drifted in and out of sleep several times during the night. Each time she was easily awakened by the night's plummeting temperatures. Just before dawn, Tejon nudged her gently.
"Maggie,"
he called, just above a whisper.
"Wake up."
She opened her eyes, surveyed their surroundings, and instantly remembered where she was and why she was there. Even so, when her eyes met Tejon's, she smiled gallantly.
"Come," he said. "We must hurry."
The couple mounted their ponies and rode off deeper into the forest. Maggie wondered if the posse was still hot on their trail. He'd warned her during the night that a group of 7 or 8 men were closing in, with a renegade Paiute known for trading his tracking services to anyone with anything of value to him, leading the way. Tejon's first inclination had been to head down into the area that the whites called California, but Maggie had begged him not to go that way. She was afraid of leading the posse toward her grandfather's farm and her only remaining sister, Mary. To please Maggie, Tejon doubled back toward Lake Tahoe and down into the valley south of Carson City. He stood a decent chance of throwing the posse off their trail if the whites were gullible enough to think Maggie would never be foolish enough to return to the scene of her crime. After a few miles, Tejon coaxed Pico to halt with a soft whistle. He slid off the horse and dropped to the ground. He lay there for just a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity before he jumped up and leaped back onto his horse. Tejon seized the reins and looked at Maggie.
6 or 7 horses are right behind us.
He eyed the landscape, worry wrinkling his brow. He didn't look nearly as confident as he had just moments ago.
"This is not the best place to be trapped."
They rode hard until they cleared the woods and came upon a clearing at the top of the mountain. Slowing, Tejon realized where they were. He gave Maggie his best stone-faced look to hide the reality that there was no place left to go with the posse right behind them. Normally, he wouldn't have gotten himself backed into this corner, but he had to admit, if only to himself, that his thinking had gotten a little muddled after she begged him not to go toward the land of the whites called California, the one place he'd thought was safest. Tejon slid off Pico, and Maggie dismounted Lightning. The sound of rushing water grew louder as they moved closer to the edge of the precipice. Over the side was a 200-foot drop to jagged cliffs where the mountain extended outward, sideways from the overhang, as if in a last-ditch effort before giving way to a waterfall inside a ravine. Tejon locked his hand around Maggie's wrist.
"What a drop!"
she gasped, looking down into the gorge. Tejon looked at the ravine, then glanced over his shoulder at the wooded area. Nothing. No sign of their pursuers. But it was only a matter of time before they emerged from the tree line. Finally, he turned to Maggie and let his hand slide down to hers.
"I am sorry. I have—"
He paused, as if searching for the right words.
"I have left us nowhere to go."
"Tejon," Maggie said with a quick sigh,
"I love you with all my heart, and I don't regret a single moment that we've spent together."
She shook her head.
"But when they catch us, they're going to kill us."
Hope had left her eyes. Her gaze left him, peered into the ravine, where it stayed briefly, and came back to meet his once more.
"So let's not give them the satisfaction."
"You know what you say?" he asked, studying her face.
"Let's go by our hand," she said. "Not theirs."
She tightened her fingers around his as the posse cleared the tree line behind them.
"I couldn't bear to be separated from you again. Let's do it together. Now."
She gave his hand a little tug.
"Before they come."
Tejon gave her a slight nod and withdrew his hand. The posse was making their way across the clearing, and Tejon hurriedly began tearing strips from the edge of his shirt to bind them together. They would jump, and they'd be bound when they did it. Most people wouldn't understand why Tejon had so readily agreed to jump to his death with Maggie, when he could have easily talked her out of it. But he couldn't bear the thought of her last hours of life being filled with anxiety and fear over what the white men would do to her before they finally got around to killing them. He was not so much concerned with himself. He was prepared to die. He'd proven that. But he didn't like the image forming in his mind of Maggie being forced to witness his torturous death. As he wound the strips around their wrists, binding them together, he knew that leaping into the ravine was the right thing to do. Tejon could only hope they'd reunite in another, future life. The posse, led by Carson City's sheriff, closed in on the renegades. They stood together on the edge of the cliffs, and the Indian was wrapping something around his and the girl's wrists. It looked like he was binding their arms together. Sheriff Simmons tugged on the reins and slowed his horse when he was no more than a few feet away from his targets.
"Stop! Hold it right there!"
The Indian looked at the girl and smiled.
"I love you."
What surprised Sheriff Simmons the most was that he'd said it in English. Not perfect English, but English nonetheless. Just when the sheriff thought he couldn't get any more disgusted, she said to the Indian,
"I love you too."
He shook his head and pushed down the bile rising up his throat. Just as he looked back and laid his hand on his gun, the ill-fated couple stepped off the ledge. The sheriff swung a leg over his horse and slid to the ground, landing on his feet. He and his comrades rushed to the cliff's edge and peered over the side. At the bottom, the Indian lay draped across the girl, as if he were still trying to protect her, even in death. He shifted his attention to his men, letting his gaze drift over their faces. Eyes wide and mouths dropped open. Clearly, none of them had expected the couple to jump. Just as well, though. The girl was spoiled for any decent man now. She was better off dead. Feeling a little cheated that he had been robbed of the opportunity to avenge the tainting of a white woman, Sheriff Simmons glanced out over the canyon. 2 eagles soared up out of the ravine and danced playfully as they took to the sky. Part 7. The Setup. Chapter 33. Rio looked at Billy, tears blurring her vision.
"That was it? That was the end?"
Her voice shook nearly as much as her composure. "Yes," Billy said, with a regretful nod.
"But what about Maggie and Tejon?"
Anguish suffocated Rio. Her heart cried out.
"What happened to their bodies?"
"I don't really know." He shook his head. "News of the tragedy got back to the tribe in the form of traders' gossip. Tejon's parents raised their baby. All their personal tokens were passed down from generation to generation."
"Where are the pouch and the bracelets?"
She prayed they weren't in the hands of some distant cousin. "My father has them." Relief escaped in her overblown sigh. Then an inquiry flashed into her thoughts.
"How do you know Mary didn't come back for the treasure?"
"Mary was hell-bent on never stepping foot in northern Nevada again," He hopped up off the ground and wiped his hands against his Levi's.
Besides that, he offered his hand, she married a man in California in 1865.
Billy pulled Rio to her feet.
There were rumors that he had some political power of some sort, so it was unlikely that she would have jeopardized her new husband's career by risking discovery as a notorious bank robber.
They strolled back toward Billy's Jeep.
So you think that Mary more than likely tucked her half of the map away and it got passed down from generation to generation, the same as Maggie's half? That's a fair bet.
After a brief interval, his face twisted with confusion.
I just don't get how Audrey got a hold of Mary's half of the map.
Rio still didn't believe that Turner was Mary's descendant. Something about his story hadn't rung true. It bothered her so much, in fact, that she lay awake in bed that night, trying to figure it out. Turner had said that his great-great-grandmother had passed her half of the map down to his grandmother, who in turn had passed it down to him, and that his great-great-grandmother was Molly.
Wait, that couldn't possibly be true. Molly died. Mary was the one with the other half of the map. Rio didn't have a clue how Turner had come to be in possession of the map, but the one thing she was sure of, he hadn't gotten it from his grandmother. Rio was willing to put money on that notion. While she believed Turner's grandmother used to tell him stories about buried treasure, Rio doubted the woman was ever in possession of Mary's half of the map. If Rio had to guess, she'd say Turner had probably acquired it from some guy who'd owed him money. Now that Billy had the one piece of information he needed to find the treasure, he stood in the middle of his living room with Rio at his side and folded the map, just like Maggie had shown him. Looking down at the final results, he was astonished. I know where this is, he said. I know exactly where this is.
Okay. She sucked in a deep breath.
We've got to be careful. We have to get in and out without our tailgaters knowing about it.
He nodded.
I've been trying to figure out how to do that. Billy,
Rio's voice trailed off.
Yeah? Do you trust me? Yes? Okay.
She dipped her chin.
I'm going to ask you to do something without explanation. I need you to trust me and not ask questions.
Go on.
We're going to need friends, she said. A lot of friends.
Her gaze traveled up and seized his.
Friends you would trust with your life.
I can get those. Billy didn't let the desire to know more about her motives consume his thoughts. Since the vision quest, he trusted her implicitly. He was confident that all would reveal itself in due course. Rio would divulge her reasoning as soon as she could.
Chapter 34.
Billy assembled his friends at the Silver Arrow, a neighborhood hangout, to find out who he could count on. It was a small bar by many standards. It consisted of a lounge, a dance floor, a DJ's booth, and a pool room in back. The establishment catered mostly to locals rather than tourists. Rio and Billy sat together at the bar, each with a beer in front of them. She nibbled on a bowl of peanuts sitting on the counter. The DJ played a song from one of those boy bands. Rio sipped her beer and rolled her eyes, showing her displeasure for the DJ's choice in music.
What's the matter? Billy laughed. Don't you like the music? Well, actually, I'm more of a rock and roller.
She set her beer bottle on the counter.
Give me the Eagles, Def Leppard, or some Alice Cooper, and I'd be happier than a pig in shit.
Billy laughed and motioned for the waitress, who was making her way across the dance floor. She glided toward him with a sexy dance.
Can you ask Ray, he said of the DJ as he handed her a $5, if he's got some Alice Cooper that he'll play for my cousin? Sure, Billy. She smiled and tucked the money inside her cleavage.
Not long after, Alice Cooper's Be My Lover blared across the sound system. Rio listened to the song's first few lines, and then turned to Billy with a sharp look. He laughed. "I think this is Ray's futile attempt at making a pass at you." "How fortunate for me." She turned away and reached for her beer. "He's got some big shoes to fill, doesn't he?"
"You know," she said without looking at him, "I've always imagined that there's a guy out there somewhere." Finally, she peered at Billy. "And from the first moment we'd meet, that'd be it." She summed it up with a shrug. "I'd see him, he'd see me, and it'd all be over. We'd both be off the market." She turned away and took a long, hard drink from her beer. "Just like that." A skeptical laugh thundered up his throat. "Instant love, huh?" She snagged a handful of peanuts and tossed them at him. "Don't laugh at me, damn it!" "Well, come on!" He was really laughing now. "You're talking love at first sight or some such shit." He grabbed his beer and shook his head. "It's ridiculous." Billy downed nearly half of the beer. Their debate over the possibility of love at first sight was interrupted by Billy's friends entering the bar. They filed in, one by one, and headed toward the pool room. Billy was drawn to the pretty girl following close behind his best friend, Danny. Her dark hair and honey-colored skin had his mind wandering. "Yeah," Rio's voice drifted into his thoughts. "Ridiculous, huh?" She was laughing, but he didn't care. He got up and headed for the pool room without waiting for Rio. Inside the pool room, he approached his friends, and the girl stepped behind Danny. "Hey, Bill." Danny gave him a nod. "What's up?" "Who's the girl?" Billy got straight to the point. "You remember my cousin, Janie?" Danny pointed over his shoulder. Rio stopped at Billy's side. Billy paid his cousin no mind. Instead, he glanced over Danny's shoulder and studied the girl. "Janie? Really?" He shook his head. "No way. Who would have thought that scrawny little girl who used to follow them around could turn into this beautiful creature standing before him?" "Janie?" He had to ask to make sure. She emerged from behind her cousin. "Hi, Billy." Her smile tempted him. "Long time no see." Rio shifted behind Billy, handed him his beer, then rested her chin on his shoulder. Janie's gaze met Rio's, and the girl lost her smile. Her eyes flared with a bitterness that said, "Who in the hell is this red-headed tramp hanging all over Billy?" She pointed at Rio. "That your girlfriend?" she asked with a chill in her voice, all the while eyeing her competition. Rio laughed. "Rio?" Billy pointed over his shoulder. "God, no, she's my cousin." Janie's hardened expression relaxed into a smile. Billy moved in closer, reducing the gap between them. "Where have you been? Last time I saw you, you were 12, maybe 13? "Away," Janie said. Rio tapped Billy on the shoulder. "Psst! Hey, Casanova," she teased him. "You want to remind me why we're here?" A few pool games later, Billy had filled his friends in on their plans. He laid the pool stick across the table. "Well," he planted his hands on his hips, "that's basically what we're talking about." He let his gaze travel around the pool table. "Question is, can I count on any of you?" Without hesitation, Danny stepped up to the plate first. "I'm in." One by one, they acknowledged their support, including Janie. Hours later, Rio and Billy headed back to his house. He drove while she counted her winnings. 245, 55, 60, 70, 80. She fanned the bills playfully and rubbed it in, since she'd gotten a few of them from him. It all started out as a friendly game of pool,
But then they started in with that macho shit, and the little pool shark put all of them in their places. In the process, she lightened their wallets for them, too. After all, it was the least she could do. "Next time," he asked, "can I be on your side?" Rio looked at him. Even though he was talking to her, he was a million miles away. He was thinking about Janie. That much was obvious. Rio had seen it when the girl walked into the bar. Billy was smitten from the get-go. "You like her, don't you?" she asked. "Who?" "Janie." "No, I don't." "Yes, you do." "Okay, so maybe she is pretty." With a slight nod, he started to come around. "Real pretty." "Don't you get it, dummy?" Rio's voice crested with excitement. "Get what?" "It's her." She smacked his arm. "The girl Maggie told you about. She said she was coming soon." He was quiet for a moment. Then he shook his head. "No way. Besides, I don't even think she likes me." "You're kidding, right?" Rio countered with a skeptical laugh. "She was ready to claw my eyes out till you told her I was your cousin." "No way." "Okay." She decided to take matters into her own hands. "Next time you see her, and trust me, you will see her again, I want you to ask her out. Take her out on a real date, out to dinner or something."
Chapter 35. The next day they took a party of 10, which included Billy's parents and Janie, and headed up to Bennett Canyon, the next stop on Billy's snipe hunt. Rio was alone, sitting on a big rock and gazing out over the canyon. All she wanted at that point was someone to tell her how she was supposed to carry on. How was she supposed to live her life without Tejon? He'd told her she was going to live a long life this time. If that were the case, it was destined to be a lonely life. Janie climbed up on the rock and sat down beside Rio. She drew her knees up and draped her arms around her legs.
"So,"
she said in a soft voice,
"where is he?"
Rio leaned her head to the side and let her gaze journey toward the girl.
"Who?"
she asked.
"The guy that's on your mind."
Rio looked back out over the canyon.
"I really don't know where he is."
She shrugged, staring straight ahead.
"I don't know if I'll ever see him again." "Well, I hope for your sake that you do."
Fat chance. Kind of hard to see a dead guy without the help of some seriously illegal drugs. Janie shifted and faced Rio, saying,
"I want to apologize to you."
"Apologize to me?" Rio rolled her eyes at Janie.
"For what?" "Well, I wasn't real nice to you last night."
Janie looked away, as if embarrassed.
"And I'm sorry about that."
"Don't give it a second thought." Rio didn't want the girl feeling guilty. She didn't see the sense in that.
"So,"
her voice lightened with a friendlier tone,
"when's the last time you saw my cousin, Billy?"
"Geez." Janie paused, thinking about it.
"It's been about 8 or 9 years now. My parents moved away, and I'm just now, finally, getting back home."
She cleared her throat.
"Does he have a girlfriend?"
"No." Rio shook her head. "Nothing serious, anyway." She leaned in a little closer.
"But I'll tell you, he sure likes you." "Really?"
Janie's smile lit her eyes.
"You wouldn't shit me now, would you?"
"No, not about something like that," Rio said.
"He's a little bit shy, but he wants to ask you out. Can I tell him you're okay with that?" "Are you kidding me?"
Janie's face beamed with enthusiasm.
"I've wanted him to ask me out ever since I was like 10.
"Then it's as good as done." Rio smiled and nodded. There may be no way she could have a happy ending, but that didn't mean it had to be that way for Billy and Janie. They could have a happy ending, and she'd make it happen.
Immediately, she started looking for the opportunity to nudge Janie in Billy's direction. It didn't take her long to find it. The guys had been digging as a pretense of looking for the treasure. Finally, Billy took a break. "Well, it's about time." She looked at Janie, who was staring at Billy. Rio went to Billy's Jeep and grabbed a thermos and then strode back toward Janie. "Hey, Janie." She put the container in the girl's hands. "Billy's been working really hard over there." Rio gave her a little push in Billy's direction. "Why don't you go offer him some water?" Janie stumbled but recovered quickly. She stepped awkwardly toward Billy. He looked up. When his eyes landed on her, he smiled. "Hey." She had the shyest look on her face when she stepped beside him and leaned against his Jeep. "I thought maybe you'd like something to drink." "Thanks," he said, taking the thermos. He drank, and her eyes were glued to him. Even from Rio's distance, she could see the perspiration dripping down his face and splattering on his shoulders and chest. She hadn't anticipated the high temperatures or the heat that came with them. They should have brought more towels. Janie worked her arms out of her outer shirt and removed it. Billy's mouth crept open as he stared at her snug T-shirt. She was well endowed, a fact that wasn't escaping Billy's notice. She offered him her blouse to use as a towel. He shook his head. "I don't want to mess up your shirt." He raked his wet forearm across his equally wet forehead. "It's okay," she said with a one-sided shrug. "It's washable." She reached up and dabbed the shirt over his brow. He made no attempt to stop her, and given the smile spreading across his face, he was enjoying the activity. "Say, listen." He talked while she mopped his neck, arms, and chest. "When this is over, you think you might want to have dinner with me?" "Yes." She dropped her arms to her sides. "I like that very much." Rio tried to ward off the bittersweet feeling washing over her as Billy and Janie flirted with one another. "Go for it, Billy. Don't waste a second. Grab hold of her and never let go." Chapter 36. While Billy and Rio's group pretended to search for the treasure, Danny had another group looking for something else. By the time Danny returned to the Tejans' home, some 24 hours later, Billy and Rio's party had long since abandoned their own undertaking. Danny entered through the front door, all eyes zeroed in on him. "Did you get it?" Rio asked. "Got it," he said with a nod and a sly grin. "Good." Rio looked at Billy's father. "When you get your hands on the treasure, you take it and you put it somewhere safe." She sucked in a breath and shook her head. "I don't want to know where it is." Billy made a noise, like he was about to say something she could easily guess. She stuck her forefinger out directly at him. "Remember, no questions." She cut her eyes toward him. "While your dad's pulling the old switcheroo, you and I are going to have to figure out a way of keeping Dumb and Dumber preoccupied." She laid her fingertips against her chin pensively. "Or at least what they think is you and me." "Well, that shouldn't be too hard to pull off," Billy laughed. "It's been pretty easy to lead them around so far." Rio looked at Bill and Carol. "Forgive me, but this part I need to discuss with Billy and Janie alone." Neither Bill nor Carol said anything. They only watched as their son led Rio and Janie down the hallway and into what was once his bedroom. Inside the room, Rio closed the door. She hesitated, trying to figure out how to propose her idea to them. She leaned against the dresser. Billy and Janie sat down on the bed. "We all know we need to make sure nobody gets followed out of town the day everything sets into motion." Her words rambled because her nerves had her rattled. She wasn't sure if they'd agree to the plan she'd concocted. Hell, after learning of the implications, they might toss her out on her ear. "You sound like you already have a plan," Billy said. "Well, I do." She nodded, mustering up courage. "If it's dark," she glanced back and forth between them, "and if Janie wears a red wig, then those lowlifes are going to think she's me." "I think I see where you're going with this," Billy said with an air of understanding. "Will somebody clue me in?" Janie asked, looking a bit confused, "because I'm totally lost." Her gaze landed on Rio. "Why do I have to dress up like you? Why don't you go with him yourself?" "Because I'm not going to make out with my cousin." Rio folded her arms together. "You are," she said, with a mischievous chuckle. "We want them to think it's me. They'll never break away from watching because that's the kind of scum they are. They'll watch till the bitter end." She shrugged. "Or sweet, as the case may be." It was a great plan. Turner's goons would be so preoccupied with what they thought was Rio and Billy, they wouldn't have the slightest clue about what was really going on. "I'm game." Billy looked at Janie. "But it's totally up to you." "Oh," Janie gave him an eager smile. "I'm in." Now came the hard part. Since they were all in agreement, they had to go back out into the living room and explain it to his parents. None of them really wanted that assignment, but both girls laid the task at Billy's feet, since they were, after all, his parents. The girls followed Billy out into the living room and lingered behind him as he faced his parents. "We have a plan," he said to them, "but it's probably best you don't ask." Carol pushed herself up from the couch and pulled Billy off to the side. "You're not going to hurt anyone, are you?" "Mom, I wouldn't hurt anybody." He charmed her with his smile. "You know that." "I don't mean in the physical sense," she said dryly. "You don't hurt Janie, do you hear me? That girl has genuine feelings for you." "Calm down, Mom," he insisted softly. "I would never hurt her." She looked at him with that same look she'd used when she could easily guess his thoughts. Eyes that bore into his soul and picked out his most intimate feelings. She crossed her arms and smiled. "I'm pleased." "About?" "About," she gave him a mocking glare, "like you don't know." Her chuckling laughter filled the air. "Janie." "Janie?" Billy asked innocently. "What about her?" Chapter 37. At 1 o'clock in the morning, when Rio felt comfortable that Billy was fast asleep in his room, she brought out her laptop and sent an email. The message read, "Dear Uncle Gabe, the trap will be set tomorrow night. The birdie will be caged day after tomorrow. Your loving niece, Rio." Chapter 38. At the elder Tejon's house, Rio waited in the living room with Bill and Carol. She wanted Billy and Janie to hurry up and come out before his parents started asking her too many questions. When they finally emerged from his old bedroom, Billy first, and then Janie, Rio eyed Janie with a measure of curiosity. She was wearing a red wig that looked very much like Rio's own hair. Bill and Carol's entire focus centered on Billy and Janie. No one paid much attention to Rio as she wandered off into the dining room. She eased into a chair at the dining table and stared up at the paintings of Maggie and Tejon. Mostly Tejon. Rio couldn't understand why the details of Maggie and Tejon's life had been revealed to her. She hadn't recalled a single inkling of Maggie's feelings for Tejon before she came here. But now she knew all too well how much Maggie had loved him, how much she, Rio, still loved him. She couldn't help but dwell on the fact that she was here, now, and he wasn't. That's what the whole damn thing boiled down to. No matter how she examined the situation, the one thing that would never change was the fact that she was alone. No matter how many people gathered around her, she would always be alone. Somewhere in the remote corners of Rio's mind, she knew Carol had entered the dining room and sat down beside her, but the information didn't make it to her mind on a fully cognizant level.
"He's very captivating, isn't he?"
Carol's voice flowed toward her. Now Rio finally, fully realized that Carol was in the room with her. Rio tilted her head and cut her eyes toward Carol, feeling the heat rising to her cheeks. She remained silent.
"I've always thought so, anyway."
Carol gave the painting another quick scan and then turned back to Rio and whispered,
"I think every woman who's ever laid eyes on that painting has fallen madly in love with him."
Carol's cheeks stained pink, amusing Rio.
"But don't tell your uncle I said that."
"There's something about him, all right," Rio said, her eyes glued to the painting.
"But there's something different in your eyes when you look at Tehan's painting."
Carol waited until Rio looked at her before she said,
"You long for him."
She studied Rio's face.
"While the rest of us merely dream about him, you truly miss him."
Rio turned away, hiding her face with her hand.
"Carol, you're embarrassing me. Wait here."
Carol pushed herself up from the table and left the dining room. Sadness laced with Rio's fascination as Tehan's portrait consumed her. The pride in his stoic expression, the depth of his chocolate eyes, every inch of his chiseled features called to her recently awakened affections. Rio had no idea how long Carol had been gone when she returned with her husband, but the intrusion was met with a half-hearted acceptance. He had a rectangular jewelry case with him. He set it on the table and slid it toward Rio.
"You should have these. After all, you made them."
Inside the case, Rio found the bracelets Maggie had made for herself and Tehan. They were neatly laid out against the black velvet. She knew what they were, and that tore at her heart. The pain of it welled tears in her eyes.
"Someday you'll meet someone, and you'll marry."
Bill laid her future out before her like he was privy to some inside secret.
"And you and your husband can carry on the tradition that Maggie and Tehan started."
Rio looked down at the bracelets and was instantly engulfed in grief. She eased the case shut and let her gaze linger on it until she found the courage to slide the jewelry container back toward Bill. "That'll never happen." She blinked at the tears and glanced back at Tehan's painting.
"I could never share these with another man."
Her voice cracked as hopeless laughter invaded her tone.
"There's not enough room in my heart for anyone else." "I don't know the particulars," Bill said, "but someday you're going to want these bracelets, so I'll keep them safe for you until you're ready for them."
Chapter 39. Rio's plan to distract Turner's goons was set in motion at the base of Prison Hill. Janey, wearing a red wig, sat on the hood of Rio's car. Billy was draped over Janey. They had their arms tangled around each other. It was supposed to be an act, but it was turning more and more passionate by the minute. Billy ran his hand along the smooth skin of her leg and up underneath her skirt. Hunger spiraled through him. Then a glimmer of what they were doing there raided the party. He removed his hand from beneath her dress.
"I'm sorry,"
he caressed her face.
"But you make me crazy."
Janey arched her back, trying to pull Billy back down to meet her lips.
"Right now we have to put on a show for them," she said between her soft, sensuous kisses. "Because they're watching, right?"
Billy towered above her.
"But," he said, shaking his head, "I won't disrespect you by getting too carried away. We have to make it look real."
She wrapped her hands around his neck and pulled him down as she rose to meet his lips.
"But later," she continued her seduction with kisses, "you're going to take me back to your place and finish what you started, right?"
"As you wish," he chuckled and moved his mouth over hers, devouring its softness. Off in the distance, Biggs eagerly watched the couple through a pair of binoculars.
"I think they're having sex," he exclaimed, still glued to the sight before him. "This guy thinks she's his cousin, and he's screwing her."
He passed judgment, but made no move to stop watching. Overtly excited to locate the couple in his sights, Taylor grabbed the extra pair of binoculars and scanned the base of the mountain until he located them.
"Oh my God, they are having sex!"
But he didn't stop looking any more than his cohort had.
"Would you look at that?"
A devious snicker rose up his throat.
"He's banging the shit out of his cousin."
While it's true that Billy and Janie were kissing and making out, they weren't having sex. Billy had made it clear that he thought more of Janie than to do something like that under these circumstances.
"You think they're out there?" Janie asked. "Watching us still?"
"Yes, I do." The seriousness in his tone was chased away by a smile.
"Are you still going to go out with me?" "You're kidding, right?" She laughed. "I'd go anywhere with you. Do anything you asked."
Billy smiled. "That's my girl." Chapter 40. This was the night that would lead to the day Rio had been waiting for, not to mention working toward for several years now. Tomorrow, all would reveal itself. She was relieved it was going to be over. The whole thing had begun to weigh heavily on her mind. Over the last few weeks, she had done everything she could to protect and provide the best possible solution for the Tejans. She had had an agenda when she came into this thing. She couldn't alter her strategy, at least not too far from the original plan. But no matter what she'd set out to do a long time ago, there was no way she could do anything that would end up harming the Tejans. She was at Billy's parents' house, waiting with Carol for everyone else to return. The whole while, she'd been pretending to watch the television. They couldn't do anything. They couldn't go anywhere. Rio had to stay out of sight. After all, Rio was supposed to be at the base of Prison Hill with Billy. Fatigue wrapped around her like a straitjacket, and she stretched out on the couch. Rio was drifting off when the front door eased open. Billy and Janie came in, and Rio sat up.
"Is Dad back?"
Billy asked.
"No."
Carol shook her head. Rio looked at her watch.
3 a.m. When had she dozed off? It seemed like seconds ago that she'd lain down.
Billy and Janie sat down on the couch. They were holding hands. The phone rang, and Carol sped across the room to answer it.
"Hello."
She was silent for a bit.
"You're okay then?"
she questioned the caller.
"All right."
She seemed to be giving in as she hung up the phone and turned to Billy. "That was Dad?" he asked, though he already knew the answer.
"Yes. They've switched the treasure and reburied it. As soon as he hides the real one, he'll be home."
"Okay. I'm going to take Janie and Rio to my house in your car," Billy said. "When Dad gets home, you guys come on over." They headed to the garage through the kitchen. Rio climbed into the back seat of Carol's car, lay down, and curled up, safely out of sight. Janie, still wearing the red wig, rode up front with Billy. He backed out of the garage and headed down the street. He didn't have to drive far before spying the familiar black SUV sitting on the side of the road. They'd pass right by them, and they'd be too close. Close enough for them to see that Janie wasn't Rio. Just a few yards from the SUV, he pushed Janie's head down toward his lap. He eyed the driver as he passed them by. The guy gave him a thumbs up.
"Both of you stay down,"
Billy said, barely moving his lips. He glanced into the rearview mirror.
"By the looks of what I just saw, I'd say you were right, Rio."
Billy's disgust flashed back at him in the mirror.
"Those goons were eager to witness some incest going on."
"What's going on?" Rio asked, but didn't move from her hiding place in the back seat.
"We just passed right by them."
Billy checked the mirror again.
"I was afraid they'd see that Janie wasn't you, so I shoved her head down like I was pushing her into my lap."
He glanced down at Janie, who was lying face up on the edge of his leg. She smiled, and he said, "I'm sorry about that."
"Seriously?"
"Oh, yeah." Billy's voice shuddered with disgust. "They assumed I was doing what they thought I'd been doing all night." He checked the rear-view mirror again. The SUV was following them and attempting to hide a couple of cars back.
"When I passed by them, the driver gave me a thumbs up."
His laughter was fueled by disgust.
"What a couple of idiots."
At Billy's house, they snuck in through the garage, and Rio headed straight to her bedroom and her laptop. She wasn't worried about getting caught, figuring Billy would be preoccupied with Janie. She typed her email with swift precision and then hit the send button.
"Dear Uncle Gabe, the birdie will be captured later today. Its final resting place will be in Brunswick Canyon. You should be in place before 8 a.m. tomorrow morning. Your loving niece, Rio."
Chapter 41. Early the next morning, an entourage of vehicles left Billy's house, filing out onto the street one right after the other, all heading in the same direction. The guys in the SUV looked a little nervous as the parade of cars passed them by. The passenger had his cell at his ear, and the driver boldly got in line behind the last truck and followed them. Rio and Janie were with Billy in his Jeep. Rio was in the back seat and on the phone with Billy's friend, Danny, who was in a truck several vehicles behind them. "They're following us?" Rio asked, already easily guessing the answer. "Oh, yeah," Danny said with a slight laugh. "It's time to reel 'em in."
"Perfect."
Rio smiled, slapped the phone shut, and leaned toward the front of the Jeep. Billy chuckled. "They're following us, huh?" She knew he didn't need a response to his inquiry. He knew the score. "They're so predictable." Rio, Billy, and Janie gathered in Brunswick Canyon with about 30 tribe members. Several of them scrambled to dig up the site again before their company was able to realize, from a distance, that the place had already been dug up recently. Rio knew that if Turner's goons were smart, they were staked out on the high ridge across the canyon. Common sense told her it afforded an unobstructed view of them. And the best part, it was far enough away to shield what they were really doing. In Turner Atkins' Vegas warehouse, the phone on his desk rang. He snatched it up and said into the receiver, "Talk to me."
"I think they found the place, boss."
Biggs' voice filtered in with great news, if it was true.
"And what makes you think so?"
Turner asked.
"They're up in this canyon right now," he said, relaying the morning's chain of events. "They got about 30 or so people with them."
Turner propped his feet up on the desk.
"Don't worry about it," he said in a poised voice. "By the time they get it dug up, I'll have an army of men at the bottom of the canyon."
He dropped the phone back into the cradle and patted the desktop.
After all, if it hadn't been for this desk, he would have never found the map fragment, the one single object that was going to give him triple, maybe quadruple, the wealth that he currently had. Had Sammy Stiles known what he was giving away in exchange for a debt settlement? Well, not everybody could be so lucky. But Turner was one lucky son of a gun to have happened upon the map the way he did. It wasn't the map he'd taken as payment. It was the desk. After he'd verified that it had once belonged to the wife of a California State Supreme Court judge back in the 1800s, he liked the idea of taking an historical artifact directly related to the justice system and using it in such an illicit manner. He'd happened upon the map some time later, while tinkering with the desk. After listening to all his grandmother's stories, he just knew there had to be a secret compartment in it somewhere, and he was right. Even so, he'd expected to find something better than old scribbles on a single piece of paper. He put it back in the desk's compartment. It seemed like the thing to do, and never gave it a moment's thought until Audrey Tejon waltzed into his life and told him about her own family's legends. The fact that they had their own map fragment did pique his curiosity, but he kept his mouth shut about what he had found. The more he learned about her family's history, the more he realized that his map and her family's map were two halves of the same map. From that moment on, Turner had one goal: to get his hands on the Tejon's half of the map. Rio stood off to the side, distancing herself from the others. It was almost over now. Soon she'd be going home, back to Vegas. Considering the circumstances, that was probably best. Maybe the quicker she got away from this place, the better off she'd be. Around here, everywhere she looked, all she could see was that this was where she'd found and lost Tejon. She gazed out over the canyon, wishing she could somehow make the loneliness go away. Her soul felt like a shell of her normal spirit. The only things left were the raw sores of her aching heart. "You okay?" Billy asked. Somehow he'd snuck up on her. "Yeah." She cleared her throat, knowing she didn't sound convincing. "You don't look okay." "I'll be okay." She forced a nod. "I'm not sure how, but I will." Rio sucked in a breath and then looked at Billy. She really needed to change the subject. "You've got the treasure tucked safely away, don't you?" "Yes." He kicked his foot against the ground, but it was too hard to do much damage. "But I still don't understand why you don't want to know where it is." "I don't want anything to do with it." She turned away to hide her disgust. "You think we should turn it over to the authorities?" "No." She whipped around to face him. "That's not it. The treasure and everything it stands for is the reason Maggie and Tejon died. The tribe can have it. Maybe something worthwhile can come from it. Otherwise, they died in vain." Several hours later, after the faux treasure had been dug up, 2 chests were brought to the surface, and the entire party had started to celebrate. But it was only for show. A facade while they waited for the bad guys to arrive. The party was interrupted by a group of men converging on them with guns, with Turner Atkins leading the way. Rio was thrilled to see Turner leading the pack, but she hid it, for now.
"Ah!"
Turner waved his gun at Billy.
"I see I'm right on time."
He eyed the chests.
"I really can't tell you how much I appreciate you digging these up for me,"
he said, downright sarcastic.
"And you, Rio."
His glare shifted to her.
"Unfortunately, that $100,000 is all you're getting out of me."
All eyes turned on Rio like she'd been hit with some sort of magnetic field. Billy gave her one of those looks that said he understood what all the secrecy was about.
"Get the chests."
Turner squawked out the order. More men with more guns emerged from the shadows.
"FBI,"
the apparent leader of the group called out. Drop your weapons and raise your hands."
The next couple of minutes probably happened quickly for everyone except Rio. It played out in agonizing, slow motion for her. Turner's goons ducked for cover and began firing at the feds. A shootout commenced between the two groups. Rio and Billy's party members began to scatter and run for cover. This turn of events wasn't something any of them were prepared for, and now Rio realized her mistake. Like a little weasel, Turner scampered behind a tree. He peeked out from time to time. Rio knew he was looking for her. She had news for him. She wasn't about to make herself an easy target. But then his sights zeroed in on Billy, as if he were a worthy consolation prize. He raised his gun and pointed it at Rio's newfound cousin. He was aiming to kill, and Rio wasn't about to let that happen. Without thinking about the consequences, she ran between them as Turner fired off multiple shots. An excruciating pain spiraled out from her back. Her legs failed her, and she slumped to the ground. Fear pounded against Billy's temples as he stared at Rio lying lifeless before him. Another shot rang out, and he frantically searched for its target. The big-mouthed guy that had called out Rio, the obvious leader of the first group, slid down the tree he'd been hiding behind and crumpled to the ground. Gunfire was still flying, but Billy didn't care. He ran to Rio and dropped to the ground, cradling her in his arms. The gunfire slowed. Billy scanned the area. The first set of guys scattered. One of the feds used his cell phone and started barking out orders.
"I need a chopper up here now. We have an agent down. She has multiple gunshot wounds."
Billy felt the wetness of Rio's blood soaking through his clothing.
"Rio!"
He called her name with frantic intensity.
"Talk to me!"
She opened her eyes and smiled at him.
"My friend."
Her quivering voice trailed off. She took a deep breath. Her eyes closed, and her body went limp.
"Rio, wake up, Rio!"
Despair poured out in his voice. Rio's spirit rose from her body. She watched with vague curiosity as federal agents rushed to her side. They forced her away from Billy and started CPR. One of the agents looked up at his senior officer, who was still on the phone.
"Sir."
He shook his head.
"She's not breathing."
Billy yanked her away from the agent and started performing mouth-to-mouth. Between breaths, he yelled at her.
"Don't you do it, Rio! Damn it, don't you leave!"
Rio felt no pain, no loss, no remorse as Billy tried with desperate fervor to revive her. A helicopter hovered overhead and landed on the hilltop.
1, 2, 3.
Billy continued to perform CPR on her.
"You wake up, Rio! Do you hear me?"
Paramedics emerged from the helicopter and scrambled down the hillside.
"Billy,"
Janie called out softly, but Rio heard her loud and clear. Janie took a couple of steps toward Billy and Rio's body. Bill clutched Janie's shoulder with a gentle yet firm touch.
"Janie, he's got to try to save her," Bill said. "Otherwise her death will forever be on his conscience."
Rio looked at Billy. Her death on his conscience was not what she wanted. Involuntarily, she slammed back into her body. Rio gasped for air.
"Rio! Rio!"
Billy hugged her.
"Thank God!"
Chapter 42. In the hospital waiting room, the Tejans waited for some news about Rio's condition. Their friends were scattered about. Everyone sat in silence. No one was talking. A downhearted veil seemed to have been cloaked around the group. It was as if, in their anguish, they'd forgotten that she'd deceived them. But Rio had paid her dues, and in the end she'd proven where her loyalties lay. Billy sat quietly beside his parents. Janie was at his side. He wished someone would come out soon and give them an update. The senior FBI man from the site charged in. Scanning the room, he caught sight of Billy. "Is there any news?" "No." Billy stood and met him face to face. "Who are you? Why were you calling Rio an agent?" A smile tried to curl on the Fed's lips. "Rio and I are FBI." He took an empty seat across from Billy's parents and waited for Billy to return to his seat. When he did, the Fed said, "She's been investigating Turner Atkins for a long time, 5 years. A doctor, a balding man with white hair, emerged from behind the double doors leading into the ER's treatment area. He paused and surveyed the room. His attention landed and stayed on the Tejans and their support group. Seeing the doctor looking their way, Billy stood and moved toward him. "The family of Rio Laricat?" the doctor inquired. "Yes, we're her family," Billy said, and read his name tag, Dr. Edward Sharp. "Well," Dr. Sharp shook his head, "she's lost a lot of blood." "I'll give it to her," Billy said, without hesitation. "Her type is rare." "Let me guess," Billy said. "AB negative?" "How did you know that?" "Because that's my blood type." "Of course," the doctor said. "Your family." Billy donated his blood, and once finished, he massaged his arm and left the lab. He headed down the hospital corridor. He'd had lots of time to sit and think about what had happened while they were retrieving his blood. He made up his mind before finishing in the lab. As soon as he was done helping Rio, he was going to find Turner Atkins. Locating Turner's hospital room was easy. Billy walked inside and stood over him. Turner's eyes popped open. Uncertainty, then fear, bulged his eyeballs. Good. Billy backed into the chair beside Turner's bed. "If you're wondering about the guards," he propped his feet up on the bed, "they're not going to help you." He shook his head and flashed Turner a wicked grin that he could have been proud of had he not been on the receiving end. "They know I'm in here, and they really don't care." Billy latched his hands behind his head. "I have connections with the FBI, you know." He couldn't help smirking. "So I guess when you hired her, the thought that she might actually be my cousin never crossed your mind?" Turner didn't say anything. He looked petrified. "Funny how that works. You hired her to pretend to be somebody she already is." Billy laughed at the irony. "But you know what the best part is? You ended up with a bunch of fool's gold." Turner gave a pained sigh. "Yep, that's right. Fool's gold," Billy snickered. "I don't think the FBI is going to let you keep it, though." His tone grew serious. "Because I can guarantee you this. I personally will be right there to testify against you in court. And you better pray they convict you, too." His voice was filled with resolve. "Because if they don't, I'm going to hunt you down and kill you myself. And that's not a threat. It's a promise." Epilogue. Las Vegas, 6 weeks later. Time passed, and Rio's wounds had almost healed completely. But the pain in her heart hadn't lessened a bit. She'd taken home an emptiness that would never heal, one she'd never be able to fill. She knew the only thing that could ever help her mend her broken soul was Tejon. But that story had played out a long time ago. It was a tale about Tejon and Maggie. But she wasn't Maggie. Not anymore. Now she was Rio. And she didn't understand how or where she could possibly fit into Tejon and Maggie's story. She sat alone on the snack bar in her kitchen. For the first time in a long time, she wore a pleasant smile as she read Billy's letter.
Dear Rio, I'm really happy to hear that you're recovering so well. I really wish you would have stayed up here for a while during this period, but I can understand that you needed a change of scenery. Everybody up here is doing well. My father, your uncle, says to say hello and that he sends his love. We hope that you understand, Rio. You were born a part of this family, and you will always be a part of it. You were right about that guy you hooked us up with. He did get us a fair price. Now, in the end, we're an extremely wealthy tribe. I do have some excellent news. Janie has agreed to marry me. Yes, can you believe it? I guess Maggie was right, huh? But you knew that all along, didn't you? The wedding is in August. I know it's short notice, but Janie and I both want you to be here. So we're hoping that you can get the time away. Rio, I hope that someday you'll find the means to be as happy as I am with Janie. Your friend and cousin, Billy Tejon.
Tears soaked Rio's eyes as she folded up the letter neatly and laid it on the counter.
Well, she said, I don't think that's ever going to happen for me, Billy.
The telephone rang. It stopped Rio from dragging herself down even further into the pit of despair, which she seemed to be so friendly with these days. She grabbed the receiver and looked at the display, making sure it wasn't her old friend Michelle, who liked to call herself Digger. Rio wasn't quite ready for her brand of digging just yet. Instead, thankfully, it was Michelle's dad, Rio's boss, and the man she'd been emailing while she was in Carson City. Rio propped the phone against her ear.
Hello? Hey, Rio, Gabe Dalton said in a friendly tone.
That in itself set Rio's nerves on edge. Gabe was never this pleasant unless he wanted something.
How are you feeling? I'm fine, Gabe. Thanks.
She tried to remain cordial while waiting for his bomb.
Hey, listen, I'm over at the grill,
the local agent hangout.
Why don't you meet me over here?
Really? He wanted to hang out with her and have a beer? Well, he was definitely up to something.
What's up? I'd like to discuss your returning to work. You're not going to fire me, are you?
Gabe shifted his cell phone from one ear to the other.
Are you crazy?
He was sitting at the bar with a beer in front of him, and he was fiddling with a bowl of pretzels.
Why in the hell would I want to do that? I'll be right there.
Gabe snapped his phone shut and turned to his companion. Eddie LaCalle wasn't exactly what the department had deemed suitable agent material. With his long hair pulled back into a ponytail, he looked more like a renegade Native American. And in a lot of ways, Gabe guessed he was. But he was honest, straightforward, and reliable. At least that's the recommendation that had come with him from the Phoenix office.
Rio,
Gabe shuddered at the thought of having to explain Rio Laracat to anyone.
She's a complicated person. She's never had a partner, never wanted one, and she won't want one now, he said. So if you'll bear with her until she gets over the initial surprise, because she is without a doubt the best agent I've ever seen.
He gave his opinion, one he'd never openly admitted to her.
And I know you guys are going to work beautifully together.
Eddie had a feeling this was going to bite him in the butt. New partners were always tough, but there was nothing tougher than a partner that didn't want to be paired up. Oh well, at least it was a girl. Hopefully she wouldn't be immune to his charms. The front entrance of the grill opened, and a hot redhead walked in. Alice Cooper was blaring over the sound system. Could it be? God, he hoped so. She scanned the bar until her eyes lit on Eddie's new boss, Gabe. She smiled and headed toward him. Well, all right. Opportunities like this didn't come along every day. He sized her up with a smile. She stopped between Eddie and Gabe. When her gaze landed on Eddie, a smile brightened her already gorgeous face. Eddie's heart fluttered with feelings he never knew he could have. Suddenly, a profound infatuation awakened from somewhere deep within his soul. He stood to greet her, offered a hand and a smile. She slipped her palm against his, and they shook hands. Neither of them attempted to let go. "You're the partner," she said, remembering Tehan's prophecy in her vision quest. It hadn't made sense when she'd heard him say it, but was it possible? Rio hadn't missed the fact that this guy looked as much like Tehan as she did Maggie. "Yes, I'm your new partner." He gave her a nod and searched her eyes as if looking for approval. "You okay with that?" "Are you kidding?" Her delightful laughter filled the space around her. "This is great." She jabbed her elbow into Gabe's side and whispered, "Get out of the way." Gabe got up and Rio sat down in his seat. She turned back to Eddie, who still had his hand wrapped around hers. Gabe moved back and stood between them. After a moment's pause, he gave a half smile that suggested he was congratulating himself on this successful endeavor. "Rio Lariquette, Eddie LaCalle." He gestured between them. "You guys are now officially partners. Have dinner on me and get to know one another." He turned and walked away. Neither of them paid attention to Gabe as he disappeared outside the restaurant. Eddie was happily engaged with Rio. He latched onto her left hand, without letting go of her right, and examined it. He let his gaze travel slowly back up to meet hers. "No rings?" She gave a one-sided shrug. "No husband either." Eddie LaCalle knew in an instant that his sole purpose for coming to Vegas had been derailed. But as far as derailings go, Rio Lariquette was going to be an interesting one.
This has been Forgotten Soul. Soul Searchers Series, Book 1. Written by Sandra Edwards. Narrated by Randy Fuller. Copyright 2010 by Sandra Edwards. Production copyright 2016 by Sandra Edwards.